Some places aren't just abandoned, they're avoided. The kind of places that make time itself hesitate. Like even the clock doesn't want to tick there anymore. The walls sag, the air feels wrong. And the silence? It isn't empty. It's listening. But every once in a while someone decides to go back. They tell themselves it's harmless. Just a building. Just a tunnel. Just another relic the world forgot. Until the place remembers them. Tonight, we're stepping into 3 places that should have stayed buried. Each one holds something that never left. Not flesh, not blood, but memory. A presence that lingers, waiting. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some buildings don't just creak when the wind blows. They scream. This is minute 60. Let's begin. On the far edge of Detroit, where half the houses had already been swallowed by weeds and time, there stood one place that even the locals crossed the street to avoid. A narrow 2-story with faded yellow siding, half-collapsed gutters and windows boarded over from the inside. The city had condemned it years ago, but it was still standing, barely, like a mouth mid-scream that never finished closing. People called it the Screaming House. Marcus Hill had heard the stories his whole life. He grew up 20 minutes from here, back when his neighborhood still had streetlights and corner stores. Every kid in Detroit knew about the house that screamed when the wind hit it. The adults said it was just air in the ducts, or maybe warped metal echoing through the crawl space. The kids didn't care. To them it was haunted. End of discussion. But Marcus wasn't a kid anymore. He was 34 with a city badge, a reflective vest, and a clipboard that said Department of Urban Salvage. His job wasn't to believe in ghost stories. His job was to gut them piece by piece before the wrecking crew came. The house was slated for demolition the following week, part of a federal cleanup project. Marcus's supervisor, a man named Denton, told him they wanted the copper wiring and fixtures out before then. The rest could go to dust. It's a quick job, Denton said, tapping the file. Just one house, but lock it up when you're done. We've had looters around there. Marcus didn't argue. He'd done dozens of these already, half-collapsed duplexes, old factories, forgotten motels, each one a reminder that Detroit had ghosts of its own, even if they weren't supernatural. When he pulled up to the house just before sunset, the light was orange and thin, cutting through a haze of industrial smog. The front yard was more mud than grass. The screaming house looked worse up close. The boards on the windows had black stains like smoke damage. The front door hung crooked, a city notice stapled to it. Marcus stepped out of his truck and immediately noticed how quiet the block was. No dogs barking, no distant hum of traffic. Just wind scraping across the siding. He did a slow lap around the property. The side gate had rusted shut, and the backyard was a mess of dead vines and broken glass. When he leaned close to inspect one of the air vents, a gust of wind slid past the house. And for half a second, he thought he heard it. A low moan buried in the walls. He froze. The sound was faint, just a shift of air maybe, but it carried something that didn't belong to the wind, a tone that felt human. Then it was gone. Marcus shook his head, forcing a laugh under his breath. Guess that's why they call you that. He wrote, "Vents, inspect later," on his clipboard, and went back to the truck for his tools. Inside, the air was thick with plaster dust and something sour, like wet insulation. Every step he took made the floor groan beneath him. The living room still had a couch, half covered with a tarp, and a rust-coloured outline where rain had leaked through the ceiling. He worked methodically, prying loose outlet covers, stripping wire, unscrewing fixtures. For the first hour, everything was routine. normal. He even put on his earbuds, letting old blues music drown out the creaks and sighs of the house. But sometime after dark, the wind outside picked up. He noticed it when one of the loose boards on a window began to rattle, then another. The draft whistled through the vents again, louder this time. Marcus paused his music and listened. There it was, a drawn-out, wavering cry that seemed to move through the house, following the wind. It wasn't a steady sound. It rose and fell like someone calling for help. He turned his flashlight toward the hallway, half expecting to see a bird or raccoon darting from a vent. Nothing, just empty air and that faint, moaning echo. Marcus told himself it was acoustics, old ductwork and pressure differentials, the kind of stuff his supervisor Denton liked to ramble about. Still, the sound crawled under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. He decided to check the basement before calling it a night. Better to get it over with while he was still thinking rationally. The basement stairs were narrow and slick with dust. Each step flexed under his boots. At the bottom, his flashlight beam caught the glint of a metal shelf, a fallen furnace, and a maze of old piping. The air down here was colder, and the sound of the wind above came through muted, like it was pressing down on the ceiling. He worked his way around the perimeter, shining the light into corners. One of the walls had a section of fresh plaster, smooth compared to the rest. That was odd. The city hadn't sent repair crews here in years. Marcus crouched and ran his fingers along the wall. He felt a faint vibration, but almost like air moving behind it. Then out of nowhere, a faint thump. He froze. It wasn't the sound of something falling. It was rhythmic. 2 knocks, then silence. He waited, breath held, but nothing followed. Rats, he muttered, though even he didn't buy it. He tapped the spot with the handle of his screwdriver. Solid. By now the wind was howling outside. And as it did, that sound returned, only louder. The house screamed again. This time it filled the space around him. It didn't sound like one voice, but many, twisting through the vents and the walls, stretching into every corner of the house. Marcus stumbled back, his flashlight jerking across the plaster. He was halfway up the stairs before it hit him that the sound wasn't coming through the vents. It was coming from inside the walls themselves. When he reached the first floor, the wind had died down. The house was silent again. His heart was hammering, hands slick with sweat. He stood there in the dark, trying to convince himself he'd just imagined it. But the way the air felt heavy, the way the house seemed to be listening, told him he hadn't. He thought about leaving right then, but he remembered Denton's warning about looters. Plus, he'd already logged overtime. He couldn't walk away because of a noise. So Marcus set up a folding chair in the living room next to his toolbox and decided to wait out the night. He turned on his small recorder, standard protocol for after-hours work, and spoke into it calmly, like it was just another job. "Salvage report, house Nobada 312, 2347 hours, he said. "Possible structural shift in lower wall. Noise appears to coincide with wind pressure. We'll reassess in the morning." He leaned back, listening to the house breathe. Every few minutes, the old siding creaked or settled. But then a softer sound joined it, a whisper. Not from outside, from the drywall. It sounded like someone quietly sobbing. Marcus held still, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The sobs were faint but clear, muffled behind the wall near the staircase. A woman's voice, or maybe a child's. He turned off the light, thinking maybe it was some strange echo from the street. But the street was silent. No cars, no wind, just that low, broken crying. That's when he realized something else. The sound wasn't random, it was responding to him. When he shifted his boots or cleared his throat, the sobs paused, then resumed, quieter, like the thing inside the wall was trying not to be heard. And that's where Marcus's story really begins, because by morning he would discover what was making that sound. And once he did, the screaming house would live up to its name in a way no one could explain. Marcus didn't stand up right away. He let the room settle around him, let the soft sobbing in the wall rise and fall until it felt like a tide he could measure. He told himself it was the wind threading some weird path through ductwork, a draft finding the precise angle of a nail hole. He told himself a lot of things, and then he reached for his utility knife. He spoke into the recorder first. Habit. It anchored him. Time stamp 0031. Audible anomalies persist from interior partition adjacent to main stairwell, initiating inspection. He set the recorder on the step like a witness with a perfect memory and clicked on his headlamp. The light thinned the dark into a cone. Dust danced through it. He put one palm on the wall and felt that faint hum again, as if a breath were being pulled through cloth. He marked a neat rectangle between two studs and scored the paint. Under the paint was old paper, brittle as moth wings. Under that, plaster. He drew the blade down, slow, careful, following the line he'd scratched, and the wall gave a long, papery sigh. The crying sound hiccuped once, like it had startled. He hesitated, then kept going. The first cut opened easily, the second grabbed, resisting like there was fibre snagged on the blade. He switched to the drywall saw, long serrations meant to chew. The house seemed to listen to each stroke. When a gust pushed against the boards over the windows, the hallway coughed a low moan. He told himself it was just pressure shifting. He also noticed his mouth had gone dry. When the rectangle loosened, he slid a wide putty knife under the bottom edge and lifted the panel out as one piece. He expected a nest. Leaves, insulation, mouse droppings that would puff into the air. He did not expect what rolled forward and thunked softly against his boot. It was a cassette tape, clear plastic, guttered with dust, the tiny reels inside frozen with brown ribbon. A strip of masking tape on the face, a name written in tidy block letters. Lisa Townsend, 09-894. Marcus didn't move, not for a full count of 5. The crying had stopped, he realized, but something else had come up in its place, a hush with edges. He angled his headlamp into the open section and saw more shine. Not pipes, not ducts, rows. He reached in and his fingers brushed more tapes. The cavity between the studs was packed top to bottom, front to back, with cassettes. Not dumped, stacked. Each one labelled with the same patient handwriting, names and dates, written like appointments in a careful ledger. He pulled a second, J. Hopkins, 5/22/90, a third, Gary L. 01/11/93. He pulled until his forearm was powdered white and his shoulder ached. The stack on the hallway floor grew to a neat, impossible pile. Dozens, scores, each one with a name, each one with a date. And almost every date fell just before another date clicked into place in his memory, like teeth. The week a face showed up on the news, the week somebody's flyer got taped to a gas station door. The week a missing persons hotline lit up with hope that thinned into silence. He didn't say anything into the recorder for a long minute. The wind raked its fingers across the siding, and the house answered in a low breath, barely a sound at all, more a pressure. Marcus knelt and flipped his work gloves off, needing the feel of the plastic. He ran his thumb over another label. Tanya, 10/14/91, just the first name. Some were like that. Others had full names or initials followed by dashes. The handwriting was steady across the years, no slant, no flourish. He found the first one that was already halfway out of the wall. It had a strip of red tape, the only one marked that way. Jerome, 20395. There was a second line under the name, tiny, as if it had been added as an afterthought. Side A only. He sat back on the stair with the tape in his palm and the wall's black square breathing cold air on his face. The recorder's tiny red light blinked, patient. He spoke quietly. Approximately several hundred audio cassettes concealed within wall cavity. All appear labelled with names and dates corresponding to local missing persons cases from the early to mid-1990s. He swallowed. His tongue felt thick. Selecting one for examination, he dug through the main tool bag and came up with his little field player. He kept it for checking radio chatter on job sites where FM still cut through. He clicked the tape door open and slid the cassette in until he felt the soft give of the pressure pads. He hit play. Nothing. Just the faint, furry hiss of aged magnetic tape moving over the head. He adjusted the tiny volume wheel. The hiss swelled, hollow and nostalgic. He waited for a voice, a cough, anything. In the hallway, the temperature seemed to slip a notch. The hiss continued. The house said nothing. He rewound a few seconds, pressed play again. The same. He clicked stop, his thumb hovering over eject. Something about the loop of silence made him feel like he was being watched by a room full of people holding their breath. He took the headset out of the bag and plugged it in, not to hear it better, but to contain whatever this was. He put the foam pads to his ears and tried again. Hiss, a flutter. And then, so faint he almost missed it, something soft at the floor of the sound, like wind pushing under a door. He froze. He sat very still and listened to that soft floor. It rose, fell, a rhythm. He slid one ear cup off to check the room. The sound didn't change, but the house did. Somewhere above him, a board made a low, tired sound, the kind of noise a person makes getting out of a chair after sitting too long. Marcus looked up the stairwell. The dark looked back with the same expression it always had. Blank. He put the ear cup back, and for a third time he rewound and pressed play. That's when the house took its first breath. The wall he had opened exhaled a cool, damp draught against his cheek. No movement of air had touched him from the cavity until now. The hiss on the tape grew teeth, gnawing at the edges with a granular rasp, and somewhere inside the wall, something answered that hiss with a whisper. Not from the headset, from the plaster, from the studs, from the house itself. The whisper was the same pitch as the hiss, but richer, like a voice humming along with a record. He yanked the headset down around his neck and the hum got louder. It wasn't in his ears, it was in the room. He stared at the open square and, for a second, he could swear the stack he'd left inside shifted, just a fraction, as if settling. Dust sieved from the top edge in a fine curtain. Puffs of white blinked in his headlamp. He spoke into the recorder, too softly at first, to trip the mic. Playback appears to be provoking structural resonance. He cleared his throat. Said it more like a note a co-worker would respect. Audio at volume low, ambient response in wall cavity. He did not say, "It's copying the tape." He did not say, "It's singing along." He pressed stop. The hum stopped. He hit play. The hum returned, now with a second voice hiding inside it. A catch in the breath, a warble, almost like a cry that had been squeezed through a long tube until nothing of the original body remained except the shape of the pain. He swapped tapes. He picked Lisa Townsend, Raw 90894, because he remembered her. He remembered his mother clucking her tongue at the TV, saying, "She looks like somebody's cousin, like she'd bring you lemonade without being asked." He didn't want to choose that tape. He did anyway. He slid it in, pressed play. The hiss was different. Every old tape's noise is its own wallpaper. This one was thinner, a quick sand sound. For a full 3 seconds, nothing else. Then a whisper so small it might have been a recording of a whisper 30 rooms away. "Lo!" A breath, a scrape. Then the tape turned into the house. The transition was slow, like the way frost takes a windshield. Edges first, then the sudden sheet as everything changes state. The whisper pulled out of the headphones and stood up around him, taller than the stairwell, thinner than cold. He felt his body react the way bodies did around things that bent the rules. Hair went up. Stomach slipped. His hands forgot what they were for. The wall gathered itself. Somewhere deeper in the house, toward the kitchen maybe, the boards over a window trembled as the wind tested them. The passage of air was ordinary. The sound that followed was not. 2 notes, high and thin, arcing down into a howl that wasn't loud, exactly, but wide, filling space so perfectly the rest of the world had to stand outside and wait its turn. The howl had layers. Under the obvious cry was another, a lower draft of grief, and under that, a sound that had no business being in a house, a room temperature imitation of lungs trying to remember flame. Marcus didn't bolt. He should have, but people don't always do the smart thing when they stand at the edge between the normal and the wrong. He raised the recorder instead. His voice didn't sound like his, clipped short by a throat that didn't want to pass it. "Playback initiated. Wall replicates content. No, wrong word. Wall emits parallel source. Content not fully intelligible. Tone resembles..." He stopped, because the word he had almost said was scream. He switched tapes like a man touching a stove, because the burner's glow had drawn him. He took J. Hopkins, 052290, and slid it in. He didn't give himself a chance to think about the Hopkins kid from the flyers in the laundromat. He pressed play. The hiss on this one was crowded, almost a sea of soft ticks. Tiny flutters of the tape as it aged. Again, the wall found the pitch, matched it, and then put itself on top of it like a voice sitting on a harmony line. The first gasp rose from the studs like steam. It hit him that if he stopped the tape and smashed the player under his boot, the sound would keep going. It had learned. He pressed stop anyway. Silence fell so fast it made noise, the high ring in the ears when a constant ends. His breath sounded rude, his boots creaked like a trespass. He realized his teeth were pressing together as if to hold his head steady. He looked at everything he'd removed from the wall. The labels made a little cemetery. The dates ran along the years with the same spoiled cadence, one after another. 1990, 1991, 1992, a run of 1993s. The writing never got sloppy. Whoever had made these had cared enough not to rush. That made something ugly unfold in his chest. The sobbing came back. Not a house-sized wail now, small. Behind the stairs again. He put his palm flat to the plaster, because he had to know if the vibration would come up through bone. It did. The wall was speaking in a frequency his hand could hear. It was at this point, this exact absurd moment where any reasonable person would leave, that Marcus thought of the people who'd never had the chance to make a choice between reasonable and not. He thought of the names. He thought of the people who put those names on flyers and brought extra tape to post office bulletin boards because the first strip never held. He thought then of the person who stacked these tapes with the neatness of a hobby, someone careful, someone who listened back to their work, rewinding and perfecting the edges. He took the red-taped cassette again. Jerome, 020395, side A only. He slid it in, he pressed play, and leaned the headset against the side of the stair so the speakers would aim not at him, but at the open square. The hiss arrived. Beneath it, a shape of a voice turned in its sleep. The wall breathed. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. The voice that answered from the house wasn't muffled anymore. It had learned the distance between air and ear and stepped through it. A man's voice, sucked thin, stretched across lumber, blurred by plaster, but there. "Hello." It said it like someone calling down a hallway, unsure whether to be loud. Hello, is this—" The next word failed in a shiver, as if the speaker remembered something right before saying it. The hiss on the tape went on, mechanical and patient, and the house took the word and gnawed it until it was only vowels. The vowels stretched like wire. And then through everything, through the hiss, through the wind, through the recorder's tiny red eye, something screamed. Not from the player, from the walls, from behind him, from above. A human scream pulled across a surface too wide for one person to own. He staggered backward, and his calves hit the stair. He sat without meaning to. His headlamp flared against the banister and threw the house's ribcage of studs and lath into sharp relief where the plaster had cracked around the cutout. The scream didn't stop. It throttled down into a sob, then climbed again, not louder, just closer. He had the sudden, stupid thought that if he reached inside the wall cavity, he could touch the noise like fabric. He didn't reach. He groped for the recorder and, without looking at it, said, "Playback of tape, Jerome. House producing synchronous response, manifesting—" He stopped. He was not going to say voice. He said, "Manifesting phonation-like artifact." That felt like a safer kind of lie. For a long time he sat there and let the tape run. Fear, like cold, settles into a workable fact if you hold still long enough. The scream turned into breaths, the breaths into nothing. The tape clicked softly as the leader finished. The player stopped itself with a clack. The house, after a tiny lag, fell silent too, like it had waited for its cue. His hands shook when he ejected the cassette. He had to use the hem of his sleeve to wipe dust off the leader because his fingers left damp spots. He slid the tape back into its shell and set it carefully on the step beside the others, as if that courtesy would be noticed by the dead, or the house, or whoever had taught the house to keep this kind of memory. He worked without the recorder for a while, because saying things aloud felt like telling a stranger which door you were behind. He pulled more panels. He discovered the cavity hadn't been a one-off hiding place. The entire run of wall along the staircase, behind the living room, even up past the first landing, had been converted into a little archive. Behind the plaster, horizontal battens had been added to make shelves. On those shelves the tapes sat like teeth. Each niche was face out, label visible. He found little wedges to keep them snug. Someone had built this with time. At the top of the stairs, the wall kissed the underside of the ceiling and made a pocket too small for tapes. It held something else instead. A stack of index cards wrapped with old thread. He slid the thread loose. The top card had a short list of measurements in pencil, cubic yards of soil, no, cubic inches. He ran a finger over the numbers. Under the measurements was a note, pressure, tone. Another card, open night, wind strongest, can teach it. The handwriting matched the labels, no slant, no flourish. Patient. He put the cards back and didn't tie the thread again. He didn't want to think about who had taught what to whom. Around 2 a.m., the wind outside shifted, angling off the river, and the boards over the front windows rattled in a pattern the house liked. The house's response came up through the banister and laid itself along his forearm. He felt the bones in his wrist answer with their own brief echo. He laughed once, a dry, humourless thing. "That's enough," he said, to no one in particular. To the house, maybe. to the part of him that wanted to see how far this could go before something gave. He packed 3 tapes into a cloth bag: Lisa Townsend, J. Hopkins, Jerome, because even if this was an echo chamber built by a very sick person, the list of names belonged elsewhere. He told himself he would take them to Denton in the morning, then to whoever Denton would be forced to call. He told himself he was doing his job. He was also stealing. The house let him. Before he zipped the bag, he did one stupid thing. One more test. He set the player on the floor at the base of the stairs and took out a blank tape from his toolbox, the kind he brought for recording job notes in the truck when his phone died. He pushed it in. He pressed the little red circle. The wheels spun. The recorder on the step blinked its own red eye at him like a cousin. He stood in the center of the hallway and said, "If there is any kind of response to sound, either natural or otherwise, I'm recording a control." He swallowed. "Control will be ambient wind." He waited. The wind obliged, slipping a long finger through a gap somewhere and drawing a breath the house clearly enjoyed. The breath thickened immediately into that almost voice, that too-wide imitation of grief. It wasn't a scream this time. It was breathing, not quiet, not staged, just the old, ordinary miracle of air walking in and out of a body, except there was no body, just walls. He let the blank tape roll 5 minutes. 10. He pressed stop. He ejected it and labelled it with a piece of masking tape torn from his pocket notebook, House Ambient, or 217. He clicked the recorder on the stair to a new file and said, "Flat and practical." Test concluded. That's when he heard the other breathing. It didn't come from the wall. It didn't come from the headset around his neck. It came from exactly where he was standing, a half-inch off his left ear, the sound of his own breath, delayed by perhaps a heartbeat, and played back to him as if the house had swallowed it and spit it back. He jerked, knocking the player, the headset swinging by its cord. The delayed breath came again, in, out, his, almost, but not. He turned slowly. The stairwell behind him was the same as it had been. Open mouth of the wall, neat rows of tapes, dust rising and settling. He breathed in through his nose, very quietly, and listened for the copy. In. Then a fraction late. In. He exhaled, the barest fog in the chilly air. Out. Then soft and empty. Out. As if something just behind him were agreeing that yes, this is how you do it. You take air. You return it. He didn't run. He couldn't afford the risk of a misstep. He gathered the bag with the 3 tapes. He shut off his headlamp so the sudden darkness would be his choice, not the house's. He moved by memory down the 2 steps to where the recorder lay. He picked it up and didn't bother to stop the file. He put his palm briefly to the cutout in the wall, a gesture that felt rude and necessary, like patting a dog you don't trust on the head before backing out of the yard. The plaster was cool. It thrummed once against his skin, very small, a muscle twitch in a sleeping thing. He made it to the living room and the front door without tripping because fear had turned his legs into careful creatures who lived there already. He put his hand on the deadbolt. The city had put a cheap bar lock on top of their own lock. He slid the bar up. It squealed. The sound felt like a match thrown into gasoline. The house drew itself up, not louder, just taller, and the delayed breath stood close enough to fog his cheek. He did not look back. He opened the door into the wet night and stepped onto the bowed porch. The wind hit him like a normal thing. The deep industrial dark of pre-dawn Detroit spread out to the edges of everything. The porch boards under his boots were real wood with real nails driven by real hands, and he could have kissed them. He closed the door gently and set the bar. Through the wood, through the deadbolt, he felt the house take a long, curious breath, as if it were learning the shape of his leaving. He walked to the truck. He got in. He put the bag on the passenger seat and set the recorder between them, still running, still catching wind, and his heartbeat and the creak of the seat springs. He did not start the engine. He put his forehead on the steering wheel and let the small, real shake in his hands have its minute. Then he set the key. The engine turned. He drove to the corner and stopped under a streetlight that flickered once and gave up. He pressed stop. He rewound 30 seconds. He pressed play. The cab filled with hiss and wind and the faint artifacting of plastic gears. Under that, his voice from minutes ago saying, "Steady. Test concluded." Then nothing. Then his breath, in the truck, as it had been. Then the second breath, delayed, copying, wrong. He listened, not to torture himself, but because he had to know whether the house travelled, whether the imitation belonged to the place, or to the tape, or to him. The second breath faded after 3 repetitions. The next sound on the recording was a small click of metal. The deadbolt. Then wood. The door. Then wind. He started the truck again and pulled away from the curb. He did not look in the rear-view mirror because there was nothing back there a mirror could help with. He drove until the house was just a cold assumption behind him, and the river put its own good, tired breath across the roads. He pressed his thumb into the edge of the bag with the tapes until the discomfort was steady, the kind that said, "Yes, this is real. You brought something with a name out of that place." By the time the sky thought about turning, he had decided what the morning would be. He would take the tapes to Denton. He would play the ambient one in a normal office where fluorescent lights made everything look like it could be solved. He would file a report with words like anomalous resonance and concealed materials, and let those words be a wall of their own between him and what he had felt when the house learned his breath. And then, because people do this, he would go back. Not because he wanted more of it, because unfinished things know your name as well as finished ones do. He didn't know, not yet, about the piece of him he'd left on the staircase, a copy measured in air. He didn't know what the supervisor would find on his recorder when the sun finally opened enough light to read by hours of wind and a faint, patient breathing that matched his own exactly, until it didn't. He only knew the house had made itself a mouth, and he had fed it sound. By morning, Marcus looked like a man who'd survived something that hadn't technically happened. He'd gotten maybe an hour of sleep on his couch, head tilted back, TV flickering blue across his face. The bag of cassette tapes sat on the floor beside him, like it was waiting for him to wake up and admit it hadn't been a dream. Every so often, he'd swear he heard the faint tick of a reel turning inside one of them, even though none were playing. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once, like the house had found a way to whisper without walls. He drove back to the salvage yard as the sun came up pale and dull, the city stretching itself awake around him. His supervisor, Denton, was already in his glass office, coffee in hand, surrounded by clipboards that all looked exactly the same. Marcus walked in without knocking and set the bag down on the desk. "Found these in the walls," he said. Denton raised an eyebrow, half expecting copper wire or stolen tools, not a handful of old tapes labelled like evidence. When he read the first name, Lisa Townsend, 1994, something in his face shifted, just slightly. Marcus told him everything except the parts that would make him sound insane. He explained the wall, the hidden shelves, the hundreds of tapes, and how they seemed to line up with missing persons reports from the 90s. He didn't mention the breathing. He didn't mention the voice that had learned to echo his own. Denton listened quietly, tapping a pen against his coffee cup. Finally, he sighed, leaned back and said, Well, hell, guess we'll need to call this in. He looked at Marcus over the rim of his mug. But until PD gets here, we need someone to keep people off that site. You're already familiar. Lock it up. Stay put. Marcus knew it wasn't really a request. And part of him, some strange, half-awake part, was relieved. Going back felt wrong, but it also felt unfinished, like closing a book halfway through a sentence. By the time he reached the block again, the sky had turned grey, and the house looked even worse in daylight. The boards on the windows were wet with condensation, curling at the edges. The wind moved through the gutters in a low hum, the same pitch he'd heard last night. He stood on the curb for a long minute, staring at it, realizing the sound wasn't being made by the house, it was being made for him. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The smell of plaster and rust felt thicker, heavier, as if the oxygen itself had learned to remember things. Marcus went through the motions, checking the locks, securing the back door, writing down notes on his clipboard. But every sound felt louder. His boots scuffed the floor like a metronome, and somewhere, deep in the structure, the house seemed to echo back the rhythm a half-second late. He'd walk once, and it would sound like two people moving. He paused, held his breath, and the air stopped moving too. The stillness pressed against his ears until he thought he'd gone deaf. Around noon, a group of teenagers wandered by. They lingered at the sidewalk, whispering, pointing at the broken windows. One of them shouted, "Hey, you hear it scream yet?" Marcus opened the door just enough to glare. The kids scattered, laughing nervously as they ran down the block. When he stepped back inside, the wind kicked up suddenly, rattling the vents so hard the whole hallway seemed to breathe. He could have sworn the laugh of one of those kids, thin, distant, was swallowed into the sound. When it stopped, the silence that followed wasn't calm, it was waiting. Marcus made himself walk to the staircase. The square of wall he'd cut open the night before still gaped like a wound. Dust had settled along the edges of the plaster, and the stacks of tapes were still perfectly in place. Too perfectly, like someone had tidied them overnight. He crouched beside the cavity and shined his light in. Everything looked normal, but the deeper he aimed the beam, the more it bent, as if the space inside the wall wasn't shaped like the rest of the house. He could hear something faint under the noise of the flashlight's hum. A soft, wet hiss, like air pushing through narrow channels. He pressed his ear close, not touching the plaster, just near enough to feel the cool draft on his cheek. The sound was subtle at first, rhythmic. Then it became recognizable, breathing, slow, familiar. It was his own, delayed by a heartbeat. He jerked back, the flashlight clattering to the floor, beams spinning across the walls. The echo stopped immediately as if startled. Marcus waited, every muscle locked, until he could convince himself it was just his imagination catching up. But deep down he already knew it wasn't. The house wasn't echoing him, it was mimicking him. He spent the next hour pacing between rooms, pretending to work, but every step he took felt rehearsed. The house knew the pattern now. When he stepped, it creaked. When he paused, the air thickened. Once he sneezed, and somewhere upstairs, a plank popped like a knuckle cracking in reply. Marcus started recording everything on his handheld device, narrating it the way he would any routine site report. But as he listened back, he realized the playback carried more than just his voice. Beneath the words, there was a second voice, softer, layered inside his breath, counting almost. By mid-afternoon, the sky turned dull silver. Marcus stood at the window, watching the wind stir the grass and thinking about the hundreds of tapes still hidden inside the walls. Whoever made them had spent years doing it. Years of recording voices, sealing them up, teaching the house to remember. That was the part that stuck with him, the idea of memory. Maybe the house didn't scream because it was haunted. Maybe it screamed because it remembered too much. He found himself whispering it out loud. It's not ghosts. It's grief. And somewhere behind him, that same whisper came back, quiet as air leaving lungs. Grief. He spun around so fast his shoulder hit the doorframe. The recorder dropped from his hand, thudding against the floor. The playback light blinked red once, twice, then stopped. He didn't move for a long time. When he finally did, he picked it up and noticed the little counter had stopped halfway through his sentence. The device hadn't turned off. It had paused. Marcus pressed play again. The last sound it had recorded wasn't his voice. It was breathing, long, slow, measured. And then, clear as day, his own voice spoke from the speaker. Except it wasn't a recording. It was happening live. The voice on the recorder exhaled, then whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "You're home." Marcus froze, staring at the little red light as if it were an eye. The word repeated, quieter. "Home." And then again, from somewhere deep inside the walls, louder this time, multiple voices overlapping, each one speaking the same word at a slightly different pitch. Home. It rolled through the house like thunder trapped underground. Marcus backed toward the front door, his heartbeat pounding against the silence. The house wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was talking. The wind outside rose sharply, pressing against the boarded windows. The house groaned in response, that old moaning sound stretching through every vent, every pipe, until it built into a low, steady wail. Marcus reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The metal felt like ice. He yanked harder, the bolt grinding, but the door stayed locked. Behind him, the sobbing had started again, the same muffled crying he'd heard his first night, except now it wasn't coming from one spot. It was everywhere, inside the walls, inside the floor. The sound swelled until it became screaming. Marcus stumbled back from the door, covering his ears. The screaming didn't sound like voices anymore. It sounded like air being ripped through a throat that wasn't there. The walls seemed to shake, dust raining down from the ceiling, but the vibrations didn't match the noise. It wasn't physical, it was resonance. The house was vibrating with something invisible, something alive. He shouted over it, "Stop!" The sound died instantly, snapping into silence so abrupt it left his ears ringing. For several seconds the only thing he heard was his own breathing. Then, from the staircase, a single word repeated itself. "Stop." He stared at the dark opening in the wall, the black rectangle filled with names. The voice that had copied him once was now speaking freely, stretching his words, testing them like clay. It didn't sound angry, it sounded curious. He lifted the recorder, holding it up to the wall. "Who are you?" he whispered. The reply came almost immediately, in his own voice again. "Who are you?" Then, overlapping it, a dozen other voices answered in unison, some high, some low, some broken mid-scream. "We're here." Marcus stepped back, tripping over a fallen plank. The smell of dust and copper filled the air like blood. He didn't remember running to the stairs, but suddenly he was standing on the landing, staring down the length of the hallway where he'd first found the tapes. The air felt charged, every sound amplified. The wind outside had stopped completely. The house wasn't breathing anymore, it was waiting for him to. Marcus took one breath in, and the floorboards whispered in response. He exhaled, and the walls sighed with him. The timing was perfect now, seamless. The house had learned his rhythm, and when he held his breath, it didn't. It kept breathing, slowly, deliberately, like it was keeping him alive. Then, as suddenly as it began, it all went still. No wind, no hum, just the faint hum of the recorder in his hand. For a moment, Marcus thought maybe the house had gone quiet for good. Maybe he'd broken whatever loop had been feeding it. Then the light on his recorder blinked twice. He looked down. The counter had started moving again, even though he hadn't pressed record. He lifted it to his ear. What he heard made his blood run cold. It was the same faint breathing as before, but this time it wasn't copying him. It was ahead of him, predicting, every inhale, every exhale, coming a split second before his own. That was the last thing Marcus remembered clearly. The rest came in flashes, the door finally giving way, the cold air of the street hitting his face, the sound of sirens somewhere distant. When the city crew arrived that evening with Denton and a detective, they found Marcus's truck idling at the curb, headlights still on, but no sign of Marcus himself. The front door was wide open, his tools were still by the wall, and the recorder sat on the step, still running. For hours it picked up nothing but wind and faint static, until exactly midnight, when the house started to breathe again. On the recording, the breathing was followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on glass. Then a voice spoke. Not quite Marcus's, not quite anyone's, just close enough to sound familiar. "I'm still here," it said. Then faintly another voice answered from deeper inside the house. "We know." The tape kept rolling for another 5 hours, through the night, through the wind, until the batteries died. The next morning, when Denton came back to retrieve the recorder, he noticed something odd. Inside the wall cavity, right where Marcus had left off, a new cassette had been added. It looked identical to the others, same clear plastic, same handwriting. The label was fresh, ink still drying. It read M. Hill, 11/8/25. And beside it, written faintly in pencil, was a second line, smudged but readable. Side A only. Morning came in thin strips, like daylight didn't want to be seen on that block. The police tape flapped weakly on the porch posts, its yellow fading to the colour of old teeth. Detective Albright stood on the sidewalk with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the house breathe without moving. It didn't puff curtains or rattle frames, it just had a way of making the air near it feel used. Denton arrived behind her, heavy steps, hands tucked in his jacket like he wanted the day to skip ahead to the part with forms. Sam, the tech, catalogued the cutout wall a shelf at a time, working slow so the labels stayed legible in the photos. The hours stretched, marked only by the soft cough of the camera and the distant rush of the freeway. On the stair, the small field recorder sat where Marcus had left it, red light steady, collecting wind like a habit. They hadn't pressed stop yet. Nobody wanted to be the one to decide enough had been heard. Inside the machine, the tape rolled and rolled, taking the house into itself one breath at a time. By 10, the block had an audience, a mail carrier with a stalled route, a man walking a dog that didn't want to be there, 2 teens pretending not to look. Albright kept them back with a glance that practiced the word no without saying it. She'd done scenes like this 100 times, but this one had the gravity of a place that had read the manual on attention and underlined every page. When she finally lifted the recorder and cupped a hand around the mic, it wasn't for evidence. It was so the moment would have a witness that didn't blink. She replayed a sliver from the middle just to hear what the night had decided to be. Wind slid through the speaker, flat and honest, and under it came the breathing, steady, unfamiliar in one way, and painfully familiar in another. The cadence matched something she'd heard the day before when Marcus spoke quietly into the room, and the room answered a half-step late. Denton listened with his jaw set, eyes narrowed as if squinting could push the sound back into an explanation. The machine clicked on, small and dutiful. The house kept time. They bagged and boxed a first batch of cassettes, each slipped into its own envelope with a number and a note. Sam's camera caught the red label Jerome. Side A, only with a frame that made Albright uncomfortable, like the photograph itself breathed. She said nothing and worked the procedure because procedure is a raft. 2 utility workers arrived to consult on the venting, men who knew how old houses get clever when they're dying. When they took up the floor grate in the front bedroom, the cut channel yawned open with a breath of library dust and metal salt. One of the workers whistled once and put both hands on his knees like he was trying to make himself smaller for it. Pressure equals tone, Albright said, almost to herself, repeating the pencil notes they'd found near the ceiling. The worker nodded without asking for context. He measured the shaft with a tape and looked at the numbers like a man reading a confession he didn't want. "Not HVAC," he said softly. "This is acoustic." The words sat in the room a moment, heavy, then found the staircase wall like a magnet finds north. Around noon, the house offered its first comment of the day. It wasn't dramatic. The wind angled off the river and found the seam above the dining room window, sliding in with the patience of a letter opener. The walls returned a sound that didn't belong in a house. Thin, careful, a breath caught halfway to a sob. Albright held her coffee up and tasted nothing. Denton let out a noise he would later swear he didn't make, the low sound men make when they chew their own doubt. Sam filmed with the steady hands of someone pretending not to have fingerprints. They tried to map the sound with the channels, the way you trace a leak by the stain it leaves. When Sam played one of the anonymous ambient tapes, just wind, just night, the walls found the pitch and rested there like a singer coming in on key. It wasn't loud, it was exact. Albright looked down at the recorder in her palm and, against all training, murmured, "What do you want from us?" The speaker gave her only wind. The banister gave her his breath back a half-second late. The best theory in the room, the only one that didn't require a new physics, was ugly. Someone had spent years teaching the structure to carry sound, cutting little throats through the floor and hiding little mouths in the walls. They'd stacked a curriculum of tapes behind plaster, names and dates like course numbers, and turned the house itself into a lung. On bad nights, in strong wind, the place remembered. It didn't speak words, not the way people do. It spoke shape, it spoke pressure. When Albright wrote that in her notebook, the words looked reasonable and felt like a lie. The first weird failure came early afternoon. Sam set a fresh card in the DSLR and took a series of shots of the stairwall, one step at a time, lower to landing. Each frame looked fine on the screen in the camera, labels crisp, plaster wounds clean. But when they transferred the batch to the laptop, a third of the images printed out with breath on the glass. Not fog, breath. The kind of cloud that catches just off a lens when someone stands too close and whispers. Sam frowned, rechecked the lens, rechecked the seals, rechecked his breath with a hand in front of his mouth. Albright circled one of the prints and wrote artifact in neat letters. The paper cooled under her pen. Denton, to his credit, did not tell a ghost story. He talked in the language of job safety, of city liability and salvage protocols, of how fast metal thieves could turn a scene into a problem. The house let him. It made him sound important without changing his volume. When he drifted to the door, phone to his ear, his voice bled into the hall and the hall practiced it back, an attentive child mouthing along to an adult's words. Albright heard it and pretended she didn't. That is often the bravest thing you can do on a weekday. At 3, they found the new tape. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't even shy. It sat at the lip of the cavity as if it had been set there for a person to see it the first time they glanced. Same clear shell, same tidy printing. The ink was still a little glossy where the pen had pressed down on the M. The label read M. Hill, 11/8/25. There was a second line, side A only. Sam photographed the cassette in place, then gloved up and slid it into a bag. Albright reached out without meaning to, as if it might vanish if no one touched it. He did say he recorded ambient, she offered, to the room, to herself, to whatever had a use for explanations. They didn't play it. Not at first. There are lines you hold for as long as you can, and then the day makes you step over them. They tagged and boxed another 50 tapes, enough to stack evenly in the trunk of an unmarked sedan. The teens came back, saw the badges, and left as if their shoes had learned hurry. The dog walker chose the other side of the street, and the dog thanked him with every muscle. When a cloud smeared the sun across the block, the house seemed to like the shadow better than the light. The air got denser, not colder, not warmer, just more. Albright finally said it. "We need to hear what's on his tape." Denton didn't argue. The utility worker stared at the floor like there were words in the grain if you just wanted them hard enough. Sam set the field recorder on the first step, like Marcus had, and clicked the wheel back to 0. The machine made its little throat-clearing whir. The tape engaged with a polite click. The sound came up slow, as if memory had a hill to climb before it could speak. Wind first. Not last night's exactly, but wind has a family resemblance across days. Then the breath, steady, human, the cadence of someone trying to be quiet in a room that doesn't deserve it. A few seconds later came a second metronome layered under the first, the delayed copy, that half-beat shadow Marcus had noticed and hated. But in this version, something had shifted. The delay closed like a book. The second breath slid forward until it was almost in time, then a hair ahead, as if the house had reached out and pressed 2 fingers under a jaw and found the pulse. Albright stood very still and listened to the imitation lead the person it imitated. There was no scream this time, no stack of voices bending into one. Just a simple lesson demonstrated perfectly. "I can breathe before you do." She felt the goose flesh come and go on her forearms without consulting her. She flicked a glance at Denton, who was looking at the recorder like it might apologize. "We're done for today," she said, and the house breathed in as if to argue, then breathed out because a rule somewhere said it should. They sealed the door for the night with a better lock and a bar that didn't squeal. The tape boxes went into trunks with chain of custody forms that made the boxes feel heavier than cardboard should. Sam carried the recorder like you carry a baby you haven't met yet, careful and a little scared. On the sidewalk, the block had emptied, the audience gone to televisions where the news had pictures that moved. Albright stood with the keys in her palm and looked at the windows that were not windows anymore and said, conversationally, "We'll be back tomorrow." The porch post shivered with the wind, or with something like agreement. The city did the city thing overnight, cones at the corners, a patrol car cruising by twice an hour, a laminated notice that said, "No entry," as if the word had ever worked on people who need it. Inside, the house possessed the dark without changing its shape. On the recording table back at the lab, the field recorder whirred and fed its last hours into a computer that didn't mind what it heard. The technicians, people good with static, bad with stories, isolated bands and plotted waveforms and labelled anomalies in boxes that went on a screen. Each anomaly looked like a breath trying to be a word. At midnight, the house kept an appointment nobody had made. The air over Tilbury Street thickened, and the boards over the front windows showed a line of moisture that wasn't dew. A breeze moved along the block and went thin where it reached the porch, the way air thins at the edge of a cliff. If you'd walked by then, you wouldn't have heard a scream. You would have felt the way your body knows when a room just decided to keep you. The patrol car turned the corner and kept going, because headlights don't change a place that has decided it will not be seen right now. Back in the lab, the recording caught it in numbers first. Hums, harmonics, a rise in amplitude that didn't announce itself as drama. Then sound, breathing, patient and sure. Not Marcus's exactly, not anyone's, just close enough to the slope of his inhale to make a throat remember work. After a minute, the voice arrived, the one that sounds like a clean copy and a broken one at the same time. It said 3 words as gentle as a hand on a door. You come back. And then softer, shaped by the gaps in the tape. We wait. Morning on Tilbury looked kinder than it was. Sun reached into the yard and found 1,000 pieces of glass nobody had bothered to sweep, and the glass gave it back. Albright parked half a block away and sat with the engine off, hands on the wheel, like she needed a permission that didn't exist. Denton's truck pulled in behind hers, tires crunching the honest debris of a city that had survived more than stories. When they reached the porch, the tape was where they'd left it, tight on the bar, stern font, a threat that would mean nothing to anyone who wanted inside. They went in together, Sam behind them with the kit. The air had the same used quality, but something else had been added to it, like a room after someone's been crying quietly for an hour and wiped everything. On the stair, the recorder waited. It blinked once, a tired eye, and rolled on. Albright crouched and watched the little reels spin through the clear window for a long beat, as if there might be a hand in there, turning them. Then she pressed stop. The click was the smallest mercy of the morning. They played the last 5 minutes first. Wind, then that patient breath leading the other breath like a dance. The final sound before the tape ended was not a word, not exactly. It was a syllable that could be a laugh or a sob, depending on the house you grew up in. Then silence, wide and clean. Sam marked the counter and looked at Albright, as if asking whether the day had a plan anymore. She nodded once. Work is a plan. They photographed the cavity again before touching anything. The cassette labelled M. Hill had shifted 3 inches forward, as if it had meant to fall and thought better of it. Sam documented the distance with a ruler because numbers are a language that keeps you from hearing other languages too clearly. Denton surprised everyone by being the one to say, softly, "Don't take that one yet." Nobody argued. The house made a tiny sound that could have been a nail deciding to rust faster. If this were a neat story, the next thing would be a crew in white suits finding a room of answers below the floor, or an old confession wedged under a stair, or a living person who wanted to talk more than they wanted to hide. It wasn't that story. It was a story about a place that had learned patience, and about people who came with questions and left with work orders, and about a man whose name had been written on a tape before anyone gave permission. Albright wrote in her notebook, "Structure with acoustic network, evidence of intent." She underlined intent and wished it made a door. City Hall wanted the line cleared. The state wanted the evidence chain immaculate. The neighbours wanted quiet. The house wanted breath. They compromised in the way places make governments do. A delay on demolition, a trailer on the curb with a lock nobody trusted, a night shift for a patrol car that would never hear anything it wanted to report. Denton filed papers sore with adjectives. Sam filled hard drives with images that fogged where no mouths had been. Albright promised herself one more day, and then after one more day, another. Before they sealed it again, she did one small, unprofessional thing. She stood in the living room and faced the staircase and said, like a person who knows their voice is a kind of fingerprint, "We're going to leave this house alone for a while." The staircase gave her nothing. The banister breathed once, late, polite. She added, because it felt required, "We'll be back." The word back leaned a little when it came out of her mouth, and the wall straightened it. They locked up. The block exhaled. People passed who would never know they had. The house kept its shape and its lesson and its syllabus of names. And because stories like this end the way they began, with something simple that sounds like nothing, Denton walked to his truck with the recorder in his hand and didn't realize until he set it on the seat that the red light had come on again. It had been recording for the last 30 seconds since he stepped off the porch. On playback, the final half-minute was just wind, just boots on wood, just the crunch of glass, and a faint, practiced breathing that matched his own until the exact second the truck door shut. It kept breathing after that, alone, patient, like a house that had learned every trick a throat can do and was waiting for the rest of us to catch up. And when Albright filed her report that afternoon, she ended with a line that wasn't for the file so much as for herself. Some things don't decay. They wait. Then she set down the pen and listened to the office HVAC hum, and for a heartbeat too long, it sounded like memory practicing the word home. They reached Blackridge just after the fog had finished deciding what to hide. The old asylum sat back from the county road behind 2 stone pillars and a chained iron gate, a long brick body with a dozen blank windows staring out like teeth. The sign was still there, half-eaten by moss. Blackridge State Hospital, closed by order of the Commonwealth, 1978. Tessa cut the engine and let the quiet gather, her breath a small cloud in the February air. "We'll be quick," she said for the camera, which was her way of telling herself they wouldn't be. The place had been sealed since before either of them was born, and yet the story of it had a way of crossing generations like an inheritance. A chemical fire in the basement, a courtyard garden that had melted into something no one knew how to name, a wing that was bricked up in a hurry on a night people still whisper about in the diner on Route 11. Tessa knew the bullet points. Every urban explorer who ever typed the word abandoned did. But bullet points are a map, and maps don't warn you about the hills. In person, Blackridge sat heavy on the land like it had learned the weight of itself and liked it. She and Evan climbed the fence at the north edge where chain link met ivy, and the county forgot to care. The frost squeaked under their boots, and the fields smelled like old hay and creosote, and the sharp metal scent of winter. "B-roll," Tessa whispered, and Evan panned the camera along the facade, catching boarded windows, a door welded shut, a busted light that had been dead longer than some towns. The wind pushed a strand of her hair into her mouth and tasted like copper. She left it there a second too long, a tiny superstition she never told anyone. Let the place have one thing first. Up close, the brickwork told a slower story, handmade, too perfect in rows, scarred by a century of weather that had sanded the edges down to something polite. There were carvings in the lintels, old-fashioned ivy scrolls, and a caduceus without wings, the sort of civic optimism you don't see anymore. Tessa touched the stone as they passed, a gentle tap with the back of her knuckles. "We're just filming," she said under her breath, not a promise, not a threat. The camera caught her profile and the way the cold had pinked her nose, and for a second she looked like a kid on a field trip to a museum that might not let her back out. They found their entry on the west side, where an addition met the original structure at a graceless seam. Someone had pried a fire door 10 inches off the jamb years ago and no one had bothered to fix it. Evan stuffed a folded towel in the gap and leaned his weight. The hinge gave with a wet groan that made both of them flinch. The smell that rolled out was basement and bandage, wet plaster, and something vegetal that felt wrong in February. "That's new," Evan said, and Tessa nodded, because plants shouldn't have a voice in winter, and yet the air had one. Inside, their flashlights painted a world that had waited patiently for light to return. Hallways tiled in checkerboard, edges buckled where water had found a low point and made a home. Doors stamped with tidy numbers and words like hydrotherapy and recreation hall, all leaning slightly as if still listening to the feet that used to pass. The settlement had cracked the walls from corner to corner, long, deliberate veins. Tessa clicked on her lav mic and said for the future audience, "We're in the West Service Wing. Floors are soft. Don't do what we do." Her channel wasn't big, but it was loyal, the kind that remembers your voice and messages you when you go 2 weeks without posting. Abandoned schools, an old Masonic lodge, a sugar mill that had bees for walls. She'd learned to treat places like strangers. You owe respect. She still did the little host asides because that's how you keep people close while you walk them into the dark. "Quick note," she whispered, panning her light along a corridor carpeted with fallen plaster. This place was supposed to have a courtyard greenhouse that connected to hydrotherapy. "If we find that door, we do not force anything. We look, we document, we leave. Promise." Off camera, Evans squeezed her wrist twice, their well-worn signal for heard. They passed a row of wheelchairs stacked like shopping carts, their rubber tires cracked into grey smiles. Someone had draped a blanket over the first one, and the blanket had turned into the kind of dust that remembers the shape it used to be. A bird had tried to nest in the seat and found only wire. The silence wasn't true. Old buildings always talk in ticks and sighs, but it had a choreography she recognized. Somewhere a drop of water found a pan. Somewhere air pushed through a seam and made a note like a bottle top. Beneath those, in the lower register you feel before you hear, a dampness hummed. They navigated by the map she'd sketched from 3 different Sanborns and 1 newspaper archive photo. Blackridge wasn't a maze exactly. It was a campus folded in on itself, a rectangle around a square where the famous courtyard had been. "Left at Ward B," she said, her voice steady because steadiness is a tool. "Then down past records, then—" She stopped, the beam of her light catching a painted arrow on the wall, pale green under grime. It read, "Greenhouse Access," in letters older than both of them and crisp enough to have a pulse. The corridor sloped down a degree, barely enough to notice until her ankles told her, and the air temperature rose like the building remembered summer. On one door, a typed notice had fossilized under Scotch tape. Courtyard closed to staff until clearance. The Scotch tape had gone amber and slid down like syrup. Tessa ran the camera across an information board where someone had once pinned watering schedules and patient gardening assignments, Mrs. W. to Rose's Wednesday, Mr. P. to Ivy, Friday, and felt something painful move under her sternum at how ordinary the plans had been. "They grew things here," she said softly, and the hallway didn't disagree. They reached the heavy steel door without meaning to rush, and then there it was, filling the passageway like a different kind of wall. In block capitals, painted the colour of a chalkboard. Greenhouse Access. Closed. The last word had been underlined twice in some forgotten hand, with the kind of firmness that thinks firmness is enough. Thick industrial hinges, a latch plate dented where hands had tried, then given up. Fine droplets clung to the metal like breath, crystallized and undecided. Tessa lifted her hand and let her fingers hover near the seam. The heat leaking through shouldn't have belonged to February, but it wasn't just temperature. It was moisture, and the weight of things exhaling on the other side. "We do not open this if it resists," she said, for the mic, turning a look on Evan that asked him to be the person who stopped her if she forgot herself. He nodded, but she saw the same curiosity in him she was trying to talk down in herself. Places like this don't just tempt, they bargain. They did what careful people do. They documented. Close-ups of the paint, the stamp numbers on the hinge, the corrosion pattern at the bolt. Evan tilted the camera to catch the way the door's edge beaded with water and then cleared, a timing that suggested pulse. Tessa crouched to peer under the threshold where old linoleum had curled. The crack under the door was sealed with something that had once been rubber and was now a memory, and through a break at the corner, a draft stroked her eyelashes. She flinched and tasted it before she could stop herself. It tasted like chlorophyll and old pennies. "Okay," she whispered, and the whisper sounded like it belonged to the place more than to her. "We're going to try the handle one time. If it doesn't want to go, we respect the closed and we move on." She wiped her palm on her jeans, then wrapped it around the steel. Cold bit first, then a slick warmth where condensation had worked. She applied pressure. The handle didn't turn so much as loosen in a way that made her shoulder think twice. She stopped, looked at Evan. He was already raising his eyebrows in their "we said we wouldn't" face. She smiled the small, guilty smile that gets couples through holidays and haunted doors. "Not now," she said. "We get the rest, we loop back." They looped, through hydrotherapy where tubs like horse troughs lined a room with windows painted shut, through records where file cabinets had vomited manila folders onto a floor that had grown things that had died and been ground into dictionary pages, through a narrow service stair where their lights caught flakes in the air that weren't dust and weren't snow, and followed them down like a blessing or a threat. Tessa narrated gently, the way you talk to people who should have been there themselves but couldn't be. "People tell stories about this place," she said, her voice even. "The truth is always smaller, and then somehow it's bigger." Halfway down the stair, Evan said, "Do you hear that?" Which is a sentence that only means one thing in places like this. She shut off her light, and he did too, and for a second there was only the iron taste of dark. Then, from below, through concrete and history, a slow, rhythmic shiver rose that belonged to neither wind nor building. It wasn't mechanical, not a generator, not a pump. It was too irregular. 2 seconds of hush, then a tremor like a heavy, damp rope being moved across tile. The sound stopped. The stair relearned its silence. "Not water," Evan said, and Tessa swallowed because her mouth had gone dry. "Not water," she agreed. They reached the ground floor hall behind the main kitchen and found their bearings by smell, loam and bleach, and the sweet rot of paper. There were footprints in the dust, not fresh, not old, size 8 or 9 in a tread pattern that made Tessa think of mailroom shoes. They led toward a service hatch where a pushcart once fit, and there the prints turned smudged and then stopped under a ceiling where condensation dripped. She filmed the last clean impression and felt suddenly protective of the person who made it. "Whoever you were," she said, "for anyone and no one, I hope you left." Blackridge had small rooms that made sense, supply closets, single offices with windows too high, and it had rooms that told you what it had once believed, open wards, a chapel, an auditorium where fresh air was a treatment and music a medicine. The greenhouse, if the map was right, lived under all of that in a way that made words not match the picture. "Greenhouse belongs on top," Evan whispered, mostly to himself, framing a doorway with his hands. "Sun belongs on top." Tessa thought about plants that live on cave mouths and decided not to say it. They doubled back toward the greenhouse door because you always return to the thing that raises the hair on your arms, even if you tell yourself there are other reasons. The corridor felt warmer now, and the painted arrow on the wall looked brighter without being cleaner. At the corner before the door, their lights hit a patch of paint that had bubbled and split like skin. Underneath, pale filaments threaded the crack, so thin you could miss them unless you were looking for something else and stumbled. Tessa angled the camera in and the lens fogged. She wiped it with her sleeve and the fog insisted. The filament seemed to retreat a fraction like muscle. "You saw that, right?" she asked, and Evan said, very level. Yes. They didn't touch the filament, they recorded it. They filmed the drip line along the baseboard, the way the moisture beaded and ran in patterns too rhythmic to be accidental. Tessa held her audio recorder near the crack and heard not plant, not machine, but a low electrical murmur like the world has when you put your ear to it in a field miles from anything. "I need to say this out loud," she told the mic, "the way you say a thing to make it live in one place instead of your head. The greenhouse is sealed. The door states closed. The air is humid despite winter conditions. Unknown biological growth is present at seams. We should stop here." They didn't. They compromised, which is how most people step over boundaries they draw themselves. Tessa lifted the steel latch as far as it wanted and no farther. Evan wedged a flashlight into the gap at the sill until the beam washed the underside of the door in a strip of bright. Air pushed out the opening and the light shook minutely as if something breathed on the glass. Through the slice, they saw tile glossy with moisture and the curve of a handrail descending as if the garden had been built into a bowl. The air smelled like overripe leaves and the inside of a mouth. 10 seconds, Tessa said, and her voice wasn't loud, but the corridor flinched anyway. "We take one look, and then we leave. I want the record of the door. We do not go in." Evan nodded, bracing the camera, positioning himself so the door would grind on his shoulder instead of his ribs if it slipped. Tessa set the mic to auto-gain without thinking, muscle memory guiding a person who'd filmed in storms and in attics and almost slipped through a theatre balcony once. She pulled. The door gave the way a person relents when they've said no twice and think saying yes once will prove a point. The seam opened to 5 inches and a world rushed their faces, heat that wasn't hot, just crowded. Humidity that carried a sweetness with a back note of iron, light that wasn't electric and wasn't sunlight, the grey-green of a pond if a pond could become an atmosphere. Tessa lifted the camera and caught a sequence that would end up paused by strangers across the country on small screens in big rooms. A glimpse of white tile furred with something pale, the outline of a wheelchair rim crusted with growth that bridged spokes like cartilage. Vines the colour of milk draped from a ceiling in slow, heavy loops that trembled without breeze. The loops flexed when the light passed. She didn't know plants could do that. She filmed 4 seconds, 5. Then a strand at the threshold uncoiled from under the door lip, the way a sleeping cat tests a paw, and the tip of it found the toe of her boot and rested there, not probing, just present, as if making acquaintances was a step you owed it. "Nope," Evan said softly, not to her, to the world, to the audience he imagined breathing with them. Tessa eased the door back and the strand withdrew without hurry, like a thing that had found a rule and respected it. The door sealed and the corridor took a relieved breath. They stood with their foreheads almost touching the metal, listening to the sound on the other side reorganize. It wasn't leaves rustling, it wasn't water moving. It had a pulse without a heart, and a hunger without teeth. Evan rolled his shoulder and hissed. Tessa reached up and touched the hinge with her fingertips, and they came away damp with condensation that had a taste if you were the kind of person who tasted your fingers by accident. The taste was green and wrong. "We got the shot," she said, and she meant it more like a diagnosis than a brag. On the way back, the building felt smaller, which is a trick some places do when they want you to think you've seen enough. Tessa tagged the rooms with whispers for the edit, hydrotherapy out, records out, cafeteria maybe, and let her light trail the floor where the filaments had shown themselves. They had retreated into their cracks, but the paint blister had risen a little more, the dome tense and thin. She wanted to press her thumb into it, and did not. "Because we like our thumbs where they are," she said for the mic, with the kind of soft humour you use when you're losing the argument with your own curiosity. They reached the service door they'd pried, and found the towel on the floor where the hinge had spit it. The gap had narrowed a hair, metal, thinking about position, the way trees think about light. The day outside looked ordinary in the way you don't trust after a long time inside. She let Evan go first and caught one last shot down the corridor, just a simple pan from the sign to the door, to the floor. A drop fell from the lintel in the frame, landed with a dark starburst, and then bled back toward the seam, as if gravity had a preferred direction here. At the car, she set the camera in the back seat like a sleeping child and sat with her fingers around the wheel, not driving yet. "So," she said, and Evan chuckled for the first time in an hour, the sound of a person reminding himself there were lungs. "So," he echoed. He looked back at the building, then at her, then down at the smear of pale residue on the toe of her boot that she hadn't noticed. He wet a cloth and wiped it away without comment, the way you do when you pull burrs from a jacket after a walk. "We say what we saw," he said. "We don't say more." Tessa nodded and started the engine. The heater coughed, and warm air that smelled like their apartment, and not like Blackridge, filled the small space. She pulled on to the county road and kept her eyes on the centre line, even when something inside tugged at the instinct to glance back. "We'll cut this as a two-parter," she said aloud, already editing, already making the story manageable. "Part 1, approach and first contact. Part 2, if we go back." Evan didn't answer, which meant he'd heard the if and liked it and hated it the same way she did. The last thing the camera caught that day wasn't a plant or a door or the way light finds tile after it forgets how. It was the dark smear the tire left in the gravel when she accelerated a little too fast, the small proof that leaving still takes a kind of damage. The wind rose behind them and skimmed the field and pressed itself flat against brick, and down under the door they had promised not to open. Something pale unspooled an inch, then two, and tasted the seam they'd left warmer than it had been. Tessa didn't see it. She only felt, a mile later, and already telling herself a kind of version, the oddest sensation, a ghost of humidity inside her mouth, and the memory of a room that had breathed without lungs and seemed perfectly willing to teach others how. They didn't talk much that night. Back at the apartment, the footage played on a loop while pasta cooled in bowls they never touched. The greenhouse door filled the screen again and again, water beading, pale filaments peering through cracked paint like whiskers. Every time the light swept that 5-inch gap, the loops overhead shifted, subtle as breath. "It's not airflow," Tessa said finally, because she needed the sentence to exist outside her head. "It's responding." Evan slowed the clip frame by frame and found the instant the strand touched her boot. The focus hunted for half a second, the lens breathing the way machines do when they want more light. Then the pixels bled a fraction, a brief green flare that didn't belong to the palette of the hall. "It glitched right there," he said, tapping the trackpad. and she heard what he didn't say out loud. The camera didn't like it. Tessa scrubbed forward to the last wide shot before they pulled the door shut. The tile curved down into a bowl, the handrail vanished into mist, and the ceiling dripped something that wasn't water in slow, perfect beads. Sleep came in pieces and left them tired. By morning, they had the kind of resolve that looks like good judgment until you get close. "We go back in daylight," Tessa said, filling a thermos with coffee like a field medic. "We stick to the first landing. We don't cross the threshold unless the door allows it. 5 minutes tops." Evan nodded and added fresh batteries and a second camera to the pack. He taped the edges of the lav mics with a ridiculous care that meant I'm saying yes because you're saying yes. The road to Blackridge felt shorter, which is another trick certain places play. The Iron Gate watched them the way gates do when they already know your name. Frost hadn't lifted yet. The grass kept its white breath. Inside the West Wing, the air remembered them. Their lights found yesterday's footprints and wrote today's beside them, and in a few places the dust had been smoothed overnight, like a hand had patted it down. Tessa narrated to her future viewers because that's how you hold the line between documenting and doing. "Second visit," she said softly. "Daylight. Same route. If the door says no, we leave." At the corner, the bubbled paint had split. A new seam ran along the baseboard like a smile that didn't reach the eyes. The filament showed again, finer now, braided the way roots do when they share a path. Tessa held the lens close and the image pulsed, micro-oscillations rolling over the surface like the invisible tremor of a heart. "Timer 5 minutes, she told Evan. He set his watch, the beep, small and brave in the humid hush. "If I'm the problem," he said, "you pull me. If you're the problem, we go." The handle turned under her palm before she asked it to. The lock tongue retracted with a quiet, damp clack, and the door yielded a measured inch, as if someone polite stood on the other side and stepped back. Warmth slid across their faces. Not summer warmth, greenhouse warmth crowded, a body heat made of leaves. The smell carried green sugar and something metallic that hit the back of the throat like a penny pressed flat on the tongue. "Rolling," Evan said, and the camera red-eyed the dark. They entered as far as the threshold and no farther. The first landing was a half-circle of tile that had surrendered to a pelt of pale vines, each the width of a finger, braided and rebraided until the floor looked woven. The handrail had grown a living sleeve, a sheath of tissue-thin growth that, when the light touched it, flexed in the slow way a creature in deep water flexes. Above, loops hung like chandeliers made of nerves, a cathedral roof of tendrils suspended from the beams. Every so often, a loop tightened and lifted itself a fraction, as if testing load. Tessa kept her boots on the barest fringe of open tile and lifted the mic for room tone. The audio meter ticked green with a sound you don't hear outdoors, a thick, soft atem of respiration. It wasn't wind through leaves, there was no leaf sound. This was skin sound, capillary sound, the faintest wet movement where growth meets growth and trades. Her breath changed without permission, shallow, slow, as if the room had modelled a cadence and she'd borrowed it. 3 minutes, Evan said behind her. His voice came back smaller, not because of distance, but because the room ate consonants first. The camera hated the largest vine on sight. Whenever Evan framed it, an albino trunk running along the far wall and vanishing around the curve, static hissed at the picture's edge, and horizontal tearing smudged the center like heat. He adjusted ISO and shutter, switched to the backup body, tried manual focus on a distant seam. Same result. "It scrambles in a narrow band," he said, half to Tessa, half to the camera, like it could grow a conscience. Not RF, it's inside the lens. The words felt like lies even as he said them. The trunk pulsed once, almost smug. They squatted to scan the soil. Blackridge name aside, there was no dirt here. The beds were sunken tiles filled with a matrix Tessa couldn't place. Not peat, not loam, not any hydroponic medium she'd seen in a YouTube rabbit hole. Fibres laced in and out of it like hair. She lifted a strand with a gloved finger, and it came up with surprising ease, trailing others in its wake as if reluctant to separate. At the root end, the filament vanished into a pellet that wasn't seed and wasn't soil. It was cloth. Blue, pilled, worn thin at a fold, the kind of blue you'd find in a uniform or a hospital blanket.
"Don't," Evan started, then stopped, because she'd already set the strand down like it burned. Her voice for the mic had the soft edges you put on things that won't fit an outline. "There's textile here," she said, choosing the word a museum would use, not a person. "There's hair, This is a composite base." She filmed a close-up, and the autofocus jumped off it like a nervous animal. In the viewfinder, the matrix crawled microscopically, not moving from point to point, but shifting within itself, a knit tightening.
2 minutes in, condensation formed on the arc of the door behind them. A single bead swelled and fell, landing on the woven floor with a noise that shouldn't have been audible and was a tiny, satisfied sip. The loop over the landing flexed, and slow as a muscle around a blood vessel, tightened. Tessa kept talking because talking was the rope she had. "We're not touching anything else. We'll get ID on the fabric later. We'll call the greenhouse an anaerobic survival environment. The word died because a shape rolled just under the skin of the soil like a small creature turning over in sleep. "Timer," Evan said, and the alarm answered. The sound, clean, electronic, collided with the living hush and came back thinner, embarrassed. Tessa nodded and eased back toward the door. The latch moved under her hand with less willingness than moments ago, as if the mechanism had swollen. She pulled harder. Metal dragged against metal with a wet, gummy scrape that made her spine complain. The door left the frame 4 inches and then stuck, not fixed, fused. A seam that had been a seam decided to be a weld. They didn't push. They did the smarter thing first, retreat on a diagonal to the frame and lower their center of gravity, boots planted, movement slow. The woven floor flexed, not much, but enough to make the tiles beneath creak in a way that matched nothing in the footage from yesterday. "Back," Tessa said, steady and small. "We already have what we need." The air pressed a degree warmer against their faces as if exhale had become atmosphere. The pulsing trunk along the wall filled the frame without being centered. Evan tried for a shot on the shoulder. The sensor blipped white, and then a black bar swam through the image like a fish. He lowered the camera, and his hand shook a little, an anger, shake more than fear. "It's jamming optics," he said, disbelief stretched thin. "I'm not making that up, Tess." She didn't argue, because the room liked argument and fed on it. "We slide the bar," she said instead. She stopped, because the metal that wasn't supposed to be there shouldn't have been a bar, had softened into the frame like a clot. She realized simultaneously what it meant. In 15 hours, the door had grown shut. They gave the door one last rational try. Shoulders braced, palms flat, push, synchronized on a count, pressure increasing with the care of people who don't want to lose skin. The seal peeled 1/2 centimeter, a damp thread of light connecting frame to door, bright as tendon. The room pulsed once, not in anger, but in exertion. "Stop," Evan said, and Tessa stopped, and the light thread snicked back into itself like elastic. They stood very still. Even the loops overhead stilled, as if listening for a new plan. They made a new plan that wasn't a plan so much as a request. "We're leaving now," Tessa said, steady as instructions. "We'll come back when it's colder. We won't bring light." She put her palm flat to the door, skin to steel, giving the place a clear, simple task. Cool this, loosen this, let this go. The metal answered with condensation that slicked her hand like breath. Under her other palm, the vines at floor level altered their lay by degrees, opening a narrow seam that returned to tile she could trust. The room wasn't saying yes, it was considering. Time did the trick it does in rooms that have their own metabolism. Seconds spread thin. The timer on Evan's watch counted to 0 and kept counting. 1, 2, 3, like a lullaby for adults. Tessa felt the urge to narrate coming back up her throat. She let it. "We still have half the hall," she said to future viewers who might never see this cut. "We can wait a minute?" The big trunk beat once more against the wall. There wasn't a sound for it, only the sense of a load bearing, and somewhere deeper in the bowl-sunk space the soil rolled, a lengthwise swell, a thing adjusting itself to be taller. The door unglued with a sound like lips, parting in a dry room. It wasn't much. A breath of slack. Evan slid 2 fingers into the seam and felt the living give in the rubber that had been rubber. "I can get purchase," he said. "On 3. They didn't count. They pulled on instinct, knees turning muscle into leverage the way ladders teach you. The seam opened to a hand width. The loop over their heads trembled and lifted, not reaching, not recoiling, a hovering, an undecided. They slipped through the gap in a side shuffle that scraped packs and elbows and left a slick across their sleeves like plant sweat. The corridor outside felt arctic by comparison. The air over their tongues tasted empty. The door eased shut behind them on its own weight. No slam, no drama, just a line drawing itself. Tessa put her forehead against the steel and let the cold collect sweat. She laughed once, a dry, square sound. "Okay." Another breath. "Okay." Evan set the camera down and pressed his palms to his thighs and kept his eyes away from the bubbled paint. When he finally looked, the dome had collapsed and flattened, leaving a stain that dried as they watched in a shape too anatomical to mistake for water. They walked out without running, because running would teach the corridor something. Every step brought a new detail they hadn't noticed on the way in, a patch where filaments had palpated up through old mortar and retreated, a drip that emerged from an unbroken wall and retreated into it again, a doorframe that had grown a lip. The service stair up to the kitchen felt different underfoot, and for a second Tessa thought she'd misremembered the stair count. She hadn't. The landings had moved a cumulative inch, the way the inside of a mouth reshapes around a word. At the exit the iron scraped again, and this time there was resistance that had never been there. Evan wedged the towel and levered the hinge with a pry bar. The frame let go in a long, sullen sigh, and cold February shouldered into them like a friend who'd been waiting outside with cigarettes. They made it to the fence with the practiced hush of trespassers who respect neighbours. Only when the chain link rattled behind them did they let the breath out the room had taught them to hold. In the car, the heater roared, and they sat with their coats open, steam ghosting off their sleeves. They should have deleted nothing and posted nothing, the way sane people do after they brush a mouth with their hands. Instead, back in the apartment, they reviewed the footage as if it might change under scrutiny. The camera had rendered the big trunk as a smudge in every frame. Sometimes the smudge looked like a thumbprint, sometimes like a scar on film. When Tessa tracked the soil roll frame by frame, the shape resolved into a swell that receded on a long exhale, then rose again, slower, like someone's back under a sheet. She scrubbed to a close-up she didn't remember shooting. The woven floor had parted in a fine, even seam. Inside the seam lay something pale and laminar, layer on layer, veined like a leaf and not a leaf. They argued in the way you argue when everything matters. Evan wanted to cut the greenhouse from part 1 and tease it in a frame or two at the end. Tessa wanted to tell it straight, with caveats, with warnings, with the kind of humility that makes algorithms yawn. "We show what it is," she said. "We show we left." He stared at her and seemed to be measuring the sentence. "We show we almost didn't." She swallowed and nodded. The nod meant next time has to be never. It also meant next time has to happen. She took her boots to the tub and ran water over the toe the vine had tested. The residue had dried to a faint glaze, opalescent if you held it at an angle. It came away in flakes that stuck to the porcelain, and then, without water moving, slid toward the drain on their own momentum. She watched until the flakes vanished. Then she watched the empty drain. When the heater kicked on, the apartment's old vent whispered, and she jumped at her own life. They set a publish schedule and pretended the timeline would decide the rest. A thumbnail, a title that told the truth without saying the part that would make people dare it. "Sealed since 1978, greenhouse door. Breathes in winter," she typed, and then backspaced the last clause and wrote, "We find it." She uploaded a still of the loops pulsing, the only frame where the camera hadn't smudged it into memory. The progress bar moved across the screen in patient blue. Outside, snow started, delicate as ash. She woke twice before dawn with her mouth too wet. Not drool, humidity. A small climate under her tongue, a phantom greenhouse her body had set to the memory of the room. The second time, she sat up and tasted metal behind mint, and she knew that if she drove to Blackridge right then, the door would be warm under her palm. She didn't drive. She sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and a quiet apartment, and the kind of silence you trust. When the upload finished, she skimmed the comments out of habit and regret. The first dozen were kind, the next dozen hungry, the next hungry and kind, which is the dangerous mix. She muted the ones that told her to go back alone or bring a knife. She pinned a note. "We never force doors. We do not disturb sealed spaces. This is documentation, not instruction." Then she closed the laptop and went to the window and looked at a city that doesn't care where you point a camera, and thought about a door, learning to say no in a new way. The greenhouse waited because that is what it had learned to do best. Down under the asylum, loops flexed and slackened on their own slow schedule. Condensation collected, fell, and was taken back. In the tile bowls, the composite matrix tightened around cloth and hair, and the long ghosts of threads unweaving to weave again. When the furnace in some distant office kicked on, a pressure wave ran through the walls and down the handrail sleeve, and the trunk along the far wall pulsed once the way a vein pulses after a long day. The door cooled. The seam dried to a line you could mistake for old cork. Tessa dreamed she stood at the threshold with the light off and the room speaking in the only voice it had. It wasn't words. It was invitation, which is older. She woke with her hand in the air like it had been on a handle. She lowered it and placed it on the quilt instead and counted backwards from 100 the way you learn in childhood for storms. She made it to 65 before the heater's whisper sounded like vines dragging on tile, and she laughed at herself out loud, quiet so as not to wake Evan. The laugh tasted like pennies. She turned on the bedside lamp and watched the normal world return to the corners one by one. Morning brought a message she didn't expect, a private email from a name that matched a line on the old watering schedule in the hall. Mrs. W's, now a woman in her 80s living 2 towns over. She had seen the thumbnail her grandson showed her and typed like a person carrying a weight. "I planted the ivy, dear," the message read. "They asked us to, for therapy. After the fire, they told us not to talk. But we can talk now. If you come by, I'll tell you where the drains are. They never closed them proper. That's why it breathes." Tessa read the line twice and felt the shape of the next section of the story arrive. The way stories do, creeping through seams, making doors warmer, asking for a hand on the handle without quite saying so. Mrs. Whitlow lived in a 1-story brick house with curtains that still held the shape of hands. Tessa noticed the garden first: winter pansies, a stubborn rosemary, 3 clay pots turned mouth down to keep the cold from stealing the soil. The living room smelled like tea and laundry starch, the kind of clean that comes from work. Mrs. Whitlow wore a cardigan the colour of rain and moved like she'd negotiated with her bones and won. "I was an aide," she said, without ceremony. Greenhouse days were Wednesdays. People calmed when their hands were busy, and the doctors liked anything that kept them from tying knots. She did not ask why they'd come. The email had already done that work. Instead, she set a saucer on the table with 2 lemon cookies and pointed to a photo on the mantel. 4 women in white uniforms stood in front of the Blackridge courtyard, hair set, smiles careful. In the background, a trellis leaned against brick, braided with ivy that looked too eager for shade. "Those drains," she said, tapping the glass. "They ran under the tile into the service tunnel. After the chemical spill, they said the lines were closed, but you can't close everything that's already inside the walls. It keeps moving where it wants." She described the night of the fire in neat, unadorned pieces like a person sorting a drawer. A patient lit a match in hydrotherapy, a vapour they didn't know was there took it like an invitation, and a curtain of heat ran along the ceiling, faster than a scream. "We got most out," she said, eyes gone to the window, as if the field could answer. "Not all. We were told to say all." They bricked the courtyard doors, painted the words "closed" on the greenhouse, and told staff the accident had ended with paperwork. She lowered her voice in a way that assumed walls had ears. It didn't end. It just went down. They asked about the drains because she had promised drains. Her hands mapped the corridors in the air while Evan sketched boxes on a legal pad. "Here's your service hall," she said. "There's a grate at the 3rd landing and 2 more under the benches. The trap they put in." It wasn't a real trap, just a plate. "If you can open one, the room will breathe easier." Easier isn't always better, dear, but it's honest. She hesitated, then added a small, dangerous gift. There was a cart with a hand pump in the closet near records. We watered when the city cut pressure to save money. That cart's metal. Metal lasts. Tessa wanted to ask how long life keeps trying after people stop asking it to. Instead, she asked if Mrs. Whitlow had gone back after 78. The woman shook her head with a certainty that had taken years to earn. "My friend tried in 81, she said. "She came home with a rash up her arms like lace and a cough that smelled like a broken weed. We laughed because we were fools. She died that winter. Pneumonia on the paper, but it sounded more like drowning." Silence stood between them for a beat, and let what it meant settle. On the way out, Mrs. Whitlow folded a paper and pressed it into Tessa's hand. It was a photocopy of an old maintenance drawing with pencil changes and a circle where a drain had been marked, but never labelled. "You'll do what you like," she said. "Not cruel, not kind, simple as weather. Tell the truth if you can manage it, and don't let that room pull you by the mouth. It likes to do that." At the car, Tessa looked at the circle and felt the next steps climb up out of the page and into her body like instructions she'd known since before she was born. They planned like careful people do, and then agreed to a thing no careful plan deserves. Daylight had shown them the door's mood. They would go at dusk when cold held its longest breath. They would bring the pump cart if it existed, both cameras, extra batteries, and a coil of soft tubing from Evan's studio kit. The goal was not heroics, it was a test. Crack the drain plate, give the room a gentler place to exhale, film whatever rose, and leave. "If it feels wrong, we abort," Tessa said. "If it feels right, we abort faster." The asylum met them with a sky the colour of steel and a wind that promised a clean night. Their footprints from yesterday had blurred, the corridor paint blister had spread. The bubble was veined now with pale threads, like capillaries that didn't belong in walls. They found the closet near records because Mrs. Whitlow remembered well, and inside it the cart weighted with dust, the thickness of a decade on its handle. Evan tested the pump. The plunger moved with the joint-popping sound old leather makes when you apologize for the years. "Still pulls," he said, small satisfaction curling the corner of his mouth. At the greenhouse door, the condensation was thin, an exhale you'd miss if you didn't know the lips. Cold had made the metal honest. The handle turned as if it had been expecting them and respected timetables. They kept to the threshold again, and no farther. The bowl below held its dream green, but the loops overhead were stiffer, as if chilled into patience. Tessa found the first drain plate where the maintenance drawing had promised it would not be. Someone had relocated it, or the room had, and the thought was both ridiculous and useful. The plate was a circle of bolted steel beneath living weave. The vines parted without reluctance, a slick of pale growth lifting like a curtain when she ran the flat of the bar under it. Evan braced the pump cart, tubing coiled like an idea, camera fixed on the seam where metal met tile. 2 minutes, he said, his watch already counting. We open, we listen, we seal. The first bolt surrendered with a weary twist that sent a smell up that wasn't rot and wasn't soil. It was colder than plant and warmer than pipe, a breath from a room that had opinions about bodies. The second bolt broke quietly, head shearing like sugar. The sound carried in a way that didn't match its size, returning from the bowl 3 times in smaller versions of itself, like echoes learning a lesson. When she lifted the plate, she saw the throat beneath, not a pipe exactly, more a mouth that had been taught the circle, and then kept it. Air moved up, the barest pressure, cool and stale and somehow clean. Evan fed the tube into the opening and primed the pump with a slow, apologetic rhythm. The first pull brought nothing, the second brought a wet consonant, the third brought fluid the colour of tea and the consistency of regret. She expected chemical sting, the failed perfume of old solvents. What came instead was sap, mineral, metallic, sweet on the tongue just from standing near it. The tube throbbed against her fingers as if something below had laid a pulse along it in greeting. "Recording," she said, her voice smaller from the room's gentle theft. "Flow is steady, odour is plant forward with iron note. Visual includes suspended strands." She almost said hair, but stopped because naming makes things truer, and the room liked true too much. The loops overhead tightened without descending, a clench up near the beams that suggested focus rather than reach. The big trunk along the wall refused to be photographed, warping pixels like heat bends asphalt. Evan swore under his breath with the tired affection you save for machines that won't do right under pressure. "Sensors clean," he said. "I can see it with my eyes. The camera won't admit it. It's not rational." Tessa wanted to say the word saturation, like light had filled past the brim and was pouring out wrong. Instead, she said 1 minute, and the room tasted the number. When the pump found a rhythm, the bowl below answered. Not loudly, not dramatically. The woven floor flexed in a wave that ran the curve and came back, and in that ripple something larger slid under the top layer like muscle under skin. Tessa kept the handle going, because stopping would declare a kind of panic she didn't own. The tube trembled, and the fluid darkened a shade, a tint you could lose in a room with colour, not here. The air went sweeter in a way that made her think of overripe fruit and mouthwash. "Close it," Evan said, without volume, right in her ear. She shut the valve and lifted the tube. The mouth below took the absence as if it had expected it, a tiny swallow that made the plate in her other hand vibrate like a tuning fork. She set the steel back and dropped the first bolt into place with fingers that had forgotten gloves. When the plate met tile, the room loosened. Even the biggest loop lost a half-inch of arrogance. "Seal," she said, the word like a clasp. The third bolt spun itself home with a small kindness she didn't deserve. They left the threshold before the room could ask for more. In the corridor, the cold found their hair and made it real again. Tessa swallowed and discovered her mouth tasted green. Evan wiped sap from the tube with the hem of his shirt and didn't complain because words would have dragged something back into the hall. They pushed the door until it decided to be closed. The latch clicked with a sound that people in old buildings recognize as compromised and good enough. They made it as far as the hydrotherapy room before the pumps stuttered on the cart. Once, like a cough. Evan set the handle gently and looked at Tessa with the kind of glance couples develop to keep plans intact. "We did it," he said, and the sentence felt like a landing he didn't trust. She nodded, because agreement is also a tool, and aimed her lens at a window that had iced from the inside in fingery patterns that looked like maps. Behind them, somewhere between record storage and the service hall, a soft, wet sound continued 3 beats past where their footsteps should have ended. They packed with care back at the apartment, hands moving in the bright silence that follows a close thing. The footage from the bowl was beautiful and wrong, the colour grading arguing with the camera about what green means. When she scrubbed to the drain sequence, the audio registered a tone she hadn't heard live, a sub-bass murmur that drew a graph like a breath taken through a reed. She lifted the headphones, and the room grew larger, then smaller, then normal. "We show this," she said. "We tell them not to do this. We put the drain map in a drawer. Night found them not ready and nowhere near finished." Tessa took the trash to the chute and stood in the hall longer than necessary because the building smelled like concrete and detergent and not Blackridge. The elevator arrived and hiccuped in that old, friendly way, and she thought about the way the tube had pulsed under her fingers, like a thing taking a pulse back. In the apartment, Evan rinsed the pump cart parts in the tub and watched the water form a sheen that moved like oil and wasn't. He turned off the tap, and the sheen kept sliding toward the drain until it caught and vanished with a sound too soft to hear. They told themselves sunrise would put distance between them and the room's desire. Instead, the morning email brought proof that stories walk faster once they stand up. A message blinked in from a handle that looked like a username and a cry for attention, but the text carried a steadiness that made their spines listen. "My father worked maintenance at Blackridge," it read. "He talked in his sleep for years, saying side A only." He carved that into the pump cart handle. "If you found the cart, it's his. If you're going back, bring salt." Tessa stared at the screen until the words blurred and reseated themselves in her mouth. She didn't say the word salt out loud. She didn't have to. The next steps were already arranging themselves in the room like furniture. The greenhouse had accepted a request and offered one back, That's a contract in older languages. Tessa zipped the camera case and felt the shape of the night ahead. Cold air, metal that sweats, a door that likes to be asked. Evan shouldered the pack and did not mention the thing that had moved under the floor, as if adjusting to a taller version of itself. They switched off lights, checked pockets, and paused by the door for the sentence that keeps people safe and almost never changes anything. We go, we keep our line, we come back. Down in the street, the city didn't care. A bus sighed at the corner. A man carried a grocery bag like a secret. Over the roofs, the sky held that blue that means evening will be clean and hard. Somewhere under real ground, near the handrail sleeve, and the bowl that didn't want to be a room, the garden tightened and loosened with the discipline of a living thing that had learned breath as an art. The plate they'd reseated cooled, then warmed, then cooled again, deciding how to feel about hands. The loop over the threshold settled into a bend that wasn't quite rest. Tessa locked the apartment and tasted pennies and mint and something green she refused to name. They waited for the kind of dusk that makes brick turn the colour of dried blood. The sky cleared to a hard blue, and the temperature dropped enough that their breath looked like speech bubbles they didn't fill. Tessa packed the pump cart's hose, fresh batteries, the maintenance map, and a small bag of salt in a zip pouch she didn't label. Evan added a compact pry bar, gaffer tape, spare SD cards, and 2 chemical light sticks that wouldn't flicker like LEDs. On the note taped to their door, she wrote only, "Quick pull." No hero stuff, back by midnight. The asylum made room for them the way deep water makes room for a diver, without fuss, without promise. Their flashlight beams slid over familiar damage now threaded with unfamiliar seams. The bubbled paint at the greenhouse corridor had cracked into a lace that moved when the air moved, though there was no draft. "Timer at 10, Evan said, setting his watch with the gravity of a pact. Tessa kept her voice low and practical. "We open the plate, we let it exhale, we reseat, we leave. If the door resists, we respect it." Becked. The door did not resist. Cold had put manners back into the metal. The latch turned with a mild complaint, and the seam opened to the precise 5 inches the room liked on good nights. Warmth feathered their faces, not heat exactly, more a density that reminded your lungs there are shapes air can take. Tessa placed a palm on the steel and felt condensation gather under her hand like gratitude or hunger. She did not say which. They stayed on the threshold and no farther, boots on the safe fringe of bare tile. The bowl below held steady, a pallid green lit from no obvious source, loops shifting in slow cycles overhead, like muscles on a timer. The trunk along the wall smudged the camera again as if sight itself were an instrument it had learned to bend. Evan set the pump cart near the jam and uncoiled the tube in soft loops, like laying down rope at the edge of a river. "Drain one," he said, and Tessa nodded because saying less made the room take less. The plate turned easier than before, bolts conceding with quiet, almost grateful clicks. Air rose through the throat, cooler than last time, edged with a metal sweetness that hit the back of her mouth the way some medicines do. She slid the tube in and primed the pump with her fingertips light on the lever. The first pulls came dry, the next thickened, and then a steady flow the colour of weak tea climbed the clear hose like an idea. Evan filmed from a low angle, careful to keep the trunk in frame, even if the sensor lied about it. They didn't speak of salt. Evan kept the pouch in his jacket pocket where it warmed against his ribs like an old word. Tessa listened to the pump's small labour and the room's answer, a faint, whole-body murmur you could mistake for hearing your own blood. 7 minutes, he said, and the loops overhead flexed in a way that wasn't threat and wasn't peace. She closed the valve a quarter turn to slow the draw, the way you do with a skittish animal, and the hose calmed in her hand. Movement rolled under the woven floor, not abrupt, not close, a long shape turning in its sleep deeper in the bowl. The camera hated it, though the eye could follow the swell as it lifted and eased. Tessa eased the tube back a hair, and the mouth below registered absence with a small, patient pull. "We reseat now," she said, already centering the plate, already reaching for the bolt like a person who has learned to say goodbye before the room asks you to stay. Evan agreed, not with words, with weight shifting toward the door. The corridor behind them breathed once, just a pressure change, a door upstairs deciding its angle, but the room answered like you call a name. The loops lifted half an inch and held, a slow inhalation that made their own lungs match by reflex. Evan's watch beeped 5 soft notes. Tessa set the plate, spun the first bolt down to bite, and felt the metal hum against her palm like the body under a cat when it starts to purr. 4, he said, and she nodded, because numbers were rails. Then something simple went wrong. The second bolt, the one that had sheared last time, refused to catch, the threads stripped to a sugar that wouldn't take a bite. She moved to the third, and it took, not perfectly, enough. The hum in the plate faded to a resting tone. The loops settled half their lifted distance. "Good," she whispered, not to herself. "Good job, we're done." She pulled the tube free and wiped the mouth with her sleeve. The liquid that clung there strung between steel and hose like spit. They closed the door until the seal touched and paused on purpose, leaving the regular gap that made the room kind. The latch clicked. Their lights found each other's faces, and for a moment they were just 2 people over their heads and trying not to be. "We go," Evan said, light, almost a joke. "We go," Tessa echoed, and the corridor decided to be narrow. They made it 10 steps before the building reminded them who it had been built for. Somewhere beyond records, a door banged softly in an empty way. Water dripped from a ceiling that hadn't produced water in 40 years. Tessa kept moving, not faster, not slower, the cadence of a person who understands threshold magic. At the service stair, the air cooled, and the old iron groaned with a memory of weight. She was halfway up the first flight when she felt it, humidity at her neck, not from behind, from below. She looked down. In the square of stairwell air, her breath hung a moment, and then slid sideways along the wall toward the greenhouse corridor, as if the building had learned a new slope. Evan felt it too. His exhale pulled out of his mouth like thread. "Keep going," he said calmly, which is what you say when one of you is about to stop and listen. They moved as a piece, boots finding the steps they had memorized, shoulders tight to the rail that felt barely separate from the sleeve of living growth they'd seen inside. At the top of the stair, the hospital did a small, rude thing. It changed the light. Their beams reached less far, colors cooled a degree, corners thickened. Tessa lifted her camera and checked the time code like that could make a corridor honest. 2 minutes to spare, she said, and the building gave them a soft, unsure echo that sounded like spare. Evan pointed to the exit. "We're out," he said, and set a hand to the bar on the service door. The bar didn't move, not rust-stuck, not locked, held. The hinge gave a millimeter and then smoothed itself back as if convinced by a better argument. Tessa didn't pull. She listened, hand flat on metal, feeling the skin temper of it, the way heat climbed from the seam. She leaned in and caught it on the air, the faintest green sweetness, new, not the old brew they'd pumped. "It's pulsing the frame," she said, honesty making the sentence more terrifying. "It's here." They took the long way without debating it. down the kitchen hall, past hydrotherapy, through a cafeteria that had theatre acoustics and smelled like nothing. Each door they met opened with small dignity and closed with the caution of old wood. Evan didn't look back because looking back in places like this writes your name on things. At the West Wing entrance, the pry gap they'd made at the start of the week had softened, the towel wedged in now damp from a condensation that had no business making it through steel. He set the bar, Tessa levered the hinge, and the seam admitted night like a favour. Outside air hit like news. It didn't matter what kind. It moved different. It tasted different. It was a thing made by sky and not by rooms. They didn't run. They folded the door toward closed and let it seat itself. On the gravel, their boots made sound that wasn't chewed before they could hear it. At the car, Tessa set the camera on the back seat and looked at her hand where the tube had brushed her fingers. A faint film had dried there, shimmery, almost pretty. She didn't lick it. She wiped it on a rag and left a silver-green smear shaped like a fingerprint learning cursive. They drove without the radio. Halfway to town, Evan blew air through his teeth and listened to where it went. It stayed with them this time. No sideways slide, no tugging seam. They parked by their building and carried the gear up in 2 trips, cart, hose, cases, and stayed quiet because quiet felt less edible. In the apartment, the heat came on with familiar clanks. Tessa took the batteries out of the cameras and lined them up like little coffins to cool. Evan checked the time code again because numbers are a way to drag a night back into a calendar. The plan was to scrub footage and sleep. The plan was good until the first file blacked out for 4 seconds at the precise moment the plate hummed under Tessa's palm. The audio kept rolling, a soft, layered pulse like a bass note you feel in your teeth. But the image was gone, then back with a smear like a thumb across a lens, except neither of them had touched it. "Glitch," she said automatically. "Power sag," he offered, though it didn't comfort him. They moved to the drain sequence and watched time try to admit what had happened. 3 minutes into the clip, the hose throbbed in Tessa's hand, and the focus breathed, and the loops overhead tightened, and the frame held. At 3:10, static spidered across a corner and crawled to the middle. At 3:12, the trunk turned to a long bruise in the center of the image that made the rest of the shot look like it had been filmed underwater. At 3:13, a silhouette edged the top right. For 2 frames only, the suggestion of a face where no face could be, not human, not plant, the contour of an opening that isn't a mouth practicing the shape of one. They paused there together and told each other it was compression. He showered first. She rinsed the pump fittings in the tub and told herself the slick on the porcelain was soap and nothing learned. She left the salt pouch on the kitchen counter without taking it out and walked it back and put it in the drawer, because line of sight matters even to things you don't believe in. When they finally lay down, sleep arrived like a compromise, thin, conditional, ready to leave if you spoke. Sometime after 1, the apartment grew humid enough to make the windows film. It could have been weather. It could have been... Tessa woke with the sensation of another breath in the room, not on her neck, not on her cheek, in the air at mouth level, modelling a rhythm. Evan rolled and said her name like a small anchor. "I'm up," she whispered. The heater sighed to a stop, and in the pause before the next sound, she heard a far wet click she had heard before at the lip of a plate. The choice they made next was small and enormous. She sat up, slid her feet to the floor, and did not turn on the lamp. She walked to the kitchen and drank water warm from the tap, 2 swallows, then 3. The pressure in the apartment reset by a hair, and the second breath, whatever had been copying, lost the beat. It waited, it listened, it adjusted. Behind her, Evan stood in the bedroom doorway with his hands open in that careful shape people make when a deer is near. "We're okay," she said, and believed it until the apartment's bathroom fan ticked once, with no power, and fell still. Morning made people again. Coffee, traffic, a neighbour's radio, playing a song that didn't belong to bad places. They cut a clean, careful video, no dramatics, no lingering on the worst frames, the language of respect with teeth in it. In the last minute, Tessa looked into the lens and said the thing she wished someone had told the version of her from 48 hours ago. "If a door has learned to breathe," she said, "it has also learned to keep." She posted it, with the comments limited and the location redacted, and the drain map nowhere. What happened next is the part that makes this story bite down. 2 days later, after early snow and a road closure and a power blip across their block, a county worker found a camera in the mud outside the asylum gate. It wasn't theirs. The model was older, the body cracked, the strap cut. The last file on the SD card was a still frame taken at night from the greenhouse threshold. Light stick glow, pale loops, a human figure on the first landing, with feet planted on the woven floor. It was Tessa. She stood very still, head tipped slightly, skin pale, delicate threads at her wrists like jewellery drawn wrong. Her eyes were open and unfixed. Police brought the photo to their apartment, because that's what you do when a picture refuses to be normal. Tessa stared at herself and didn't remember being there, and the part of her that does not lie for cameras went very quiet. Evan stepped to the sink and gripped the counter and kept breathing like he was teaching someone how. The detective asked questions gently. Did they go back alone? Did they sleepwalk? Did they know anyone else who might? And left dots unconnected because his face had learned not to draw certain lines on weekdays. That night, the humidity came back for an hour and left a fern print on the inside of their bedroom window. It faded by morning, the way fever does. They didn't return to Blackridge again. The video stayed up, then down, then up again, when people begged, and she decided the truth was at least a kind of fence. Mrs. Whitlow mailed them a clipping. Greenhouse demolition understudy. In the margin, the old woman had written, "Doors don't forget. Be kind with yours, dear." And because every story in buildings like this ends with the smallest sound, something you can pretend you didn't notice, I'll tell you ours. In their apartment, long after midnight, when the city laid its weight down, the bathroom fan ticked once. Then the kitchen vent sighed, as if someone had leaned close with a mouth that had learned the shape of their breath. It didn't speak, it waited. That's the part that makes people shiver, knowing some things don't stop when you walk away. They wait where dark meets tile, practicing your name in chlorophyll and patience, until the next door opens 5 polite inches and the air remembers how to move. Eli didn't believe in echoes that arrived before the sound that made them. He believed in track gauge, in torque specs, in the way a good wrench felt like certainty in the hand. After a decade with Mountain and Silver Line maintenance, he'd learned that tunnels complain long before they fail. Hairline fractures sing, rails talk in the cold. He trusted those voices because they obeyed physics and schedules. On a Monday that pretended to be spring, his dispatcher slid a file across the counter like it might bite. Old Spur 3, sealed since the 70s, had started acting up. A construction crew on the ridge claimed they heard a whistle at night, thin as a thread, exactly 12:13 a.m. for 3 straight weeks. "You'll check. You'll say it's frost heave. We'll all go home," the dispatcher said, not quite smiling. Eli signed the work order anyway because men like him say yes to problems shaped like doors. The portal sat where the town's first silver dreams had been stacked and abandoned, a black mouth cut into igneous stone and bricked up with cheap optimism. A plain steel gate had replaced the bricks years ago, padlocked and tagged by teenagers who didn't believe in anything except better summers. Someone had painted a message over the rust with a road stripe brush, letters tall and white and confident as a dare. Stay off the tracks at 12:13. Eli stood there long enough to let the wind read it to him twice. He took inventory the way he always did: headlamp, helmet, respirator, laser rangefinder, inclinometer, 2 puck mics, 3 geophones, a thermal camera the company never asked about, and a coffee in a thermos that had outlived 2 trucks. The gate complained when he cut the lock, the sound thin and old and a little offended. Rock swallowed the first few steps of his boots like it had been waiting. He didn't speak. Some places make you save breath for later. Inside, the air changed temperature without changing seasons. It went from mountain cool to cellar cold, then settled into a constant that had nothing to do with weather. The first 50 yards were as expected: soot ghosts on granite, calcite freckles where groundwater earned its keep, creosote breathing out of old ties like a memory. Past that, the tunnel's mood shifted. The walls learned a curve. The ballast underfoot grew smoother, as if a long, invisible hand had pressed down and polished stone. He stopped at a cavity where a maintenance alcove had been cut into the wall a lifetime ago. It held a rotten bench and a tin sign half-eaten by rust. Warning, no idling. Someone had underlined, no, in a nail. Eli smiled despite himself, then let it die on his face when his headlamp picked out a small, recent pile of offerings on the bench. 3 dead glow sticks, a crushed candy wrapper, a scrap of paper with a prayer written on it in a hand that didn't trust itself. He didn't touch any of it. He set his first geophone on the rail like a whisper and waited for the little LED to steady. The device listened with the kind of patience people hire out of themselves as they age. Nothing but earth settling and groundwater speaking syllables the instrument could not translate. He logged the spot, the time, the ambient temperature, and the charge level of his doubt. The graffiti at the portal wasn't nothing, but most warnings were written by men who wanted attention, and most attention does not keep trains from killing you. The tunnel pinched at 120 yards like a snake that had eaten once and never forgiven itself. Wood shoring had been set there in the 50s, a handsome crisscross of timbers, now bowed into a geometry that was still neat enough to be dangerous. Eli ran the thermal camera across it, watching false colors tell a story about trapped cold. He heard small rockfall somewhere ahead and told himself it was the kind of complaint that came with age, not intention. He found the second message after the choke point. Not paint this time, chalk. Letters written at knee height, like a person who had been heavy with hurry. 12:13. It is not a time exactly, it is a choice. Eli lifted his phone to take a photo and caught his own hand in the frame, dirty and squared off by work, a small proof that he belonged to the practical world. He took the picture anyway and geotagged it for no one but himself. 100 yards deeper, sound changed shape. The tunnel swallowed treble and returned bass, which made his bootfalls feel like rude guests. He shut off his headlamp and stood in the kind of black that erases your sense of scale. In the first second, his ears did the thing, a high sugar buzz. In the next, the space breathed once, a long nowhere exhale, as pressure equalized along every hard surface. Eli counted to 10, turned the light back on, and said out loud in his inside voice, "All right," just to hear his voice behave. He placed the second geophone and felt foolish for expecting ceremony. Instruments don't care about messages. They put their faces on steel and confess whatever the steel believes. The LED pulsed green, found the rail's heartbeat, and went still. He set both puck mics on the tie plates, clipped their transmitters to the web of the rail, and checked the handheld receiver. Static, then open air. He raised the sensitivity until a low, uninterested hum filled the headset, the song of copper and distance. Near the old junction box, he found the first wet, not puddle wet, sweat. The stone had grown a sheen like something nervous, and the rails wore frost at their edges where cold met exhale. He bent to touch the frost and found it was not cold, just refusal. His glove came away pricked with filings. "You are not special," he told the tunnel, "the way you talk to a dog that looks too smart." He took a long drink and let the cup lip clack his teeth so the air would know his mouth had work to do. He placed the inclinometer at the center line and watched the little bubble go long and sleepy and then, just for one breath, lean east and correct itself. He waited for it to do it again. It didn't. You can't write a report with one flinch. He logged it anyway, because good paperwork is a map you draw for the version of you who may not come back the same. At 200 yards, rust ended, not tapered, ended. Railheads that had sat unused for half a century wore a polish you couldn't interrupt with a fingernail. Eli crouched and blew dust from the web, expecting soot to leap, and watched nothing leap. The steel looked like it had been touched every night by something soft and persistent. The thought rose and he pushed it back down with a joke he didn't say, the kind that starts the wrong kind of laughter. He marked the boundary with a chalk X on the tie and set the last of his gear like a person drawing a perimeter around a story. He dialed the RF receiver to a narrow band and let the noise floor settle. A thin whistle lived there, not note, not instrument, the bare suggestion of a tone the ear invents to explain steady pressure. He turned the volume down because sometimes hearing too much makes you stupid. He turned his head and listened with the part of him that had survived other tunnels. The mountains said nothing. Behind him, the world he had walked through rearranged itself into something like memory, and he didn't turn to check. Turning wastes time when time is a word that feels too large for a shift. He looked at the geophone readout, a lazy line. He tapped the rail with the handle of his wrench and watched the line wake and sleep. His movements told him the measurement was honest. He put his back against the tunnel wall and let rock hold him like a seat. He could have left then. He should have. He had enough for the form, minor subsidence, temperature anomalies, stall condensation, graffiti to be sandblasted. But the file on the counter at the yard had mentioned the crew by name, the men who had heard the 1213. Most of them were transplanted from elsewhere, men who didn't scare easy, men who spent nights under infrastructure listening to machines explain themselves. They didn't go in for stories. They had said, "We heard a whistle that didn't echo." That part stuck. It bothered the practical shape of Eli's head. He checked his watch and did the arithmetic on how much coffee and patience it would take to sit in a tunnel until the hour Adair had suggested. He had a spare battery for the headlamp and 3 for the handheld, and enough battery for the geophones to outlast him. He had a jacket that had been loyal in weather no one brags about. He had an ex-wife who would not worry, and a foreman who would not ask the right questions until morning. He found a flat on the wall that wasn't wet, sat, and let the clock begin its long narrowing. Listening occupies you, waiting empties you. He alternated. He followed water-down stone to where it darkened the ballast in shapes like old borders. He traced scorch on granite where a long-ago short had erupted and documented it for someone who would never read the note. He turned off his light in 5 counts to learn the black's edges, then turned it back on to make sure the tunnel hadn't moved closer. He thought about the white letters on the gate and resented whoever had written them, not for the warning, but for the hour they had stolen. He dozed once, brief and ugly, the kind of sleep that drops you into a hole and pulls you out by the hair. In the dream, he stood on a platform none of his lines had ever owned and watched a headlight kneel out of night without the courtesy of sound. Waking left the stale taste of brakes on his tongue. He swallowed and found it was only riveted air. His watch read 11:58. The geophones were flat as patience. He stood and stretched his back and reminded himself that the world is the world until it isn't. When the minute hand lined up with midnight, the tunnel did a thing nobody gives consent to. The temperature lifted a degree and then another without moving air. The ballast under his boots settled like a person on a couch finding the dip. Eli put his palm 2 inches above the rail and felt nothing. And then 1 heartbeat's worth of something. No heat, no vibration, a presence shaped like a line that pretended not to be made of steel. The RF receiver woke like a nervous animal and went quiet because he told it to. Hold. He spoke into his handheld recorder, not like a man telling a story, but like a man mailing himself instructions. Station time mark 00, ambient stable, minor pressure change, beginning observation. His voice sounded thin and annoyingly careful. He didn't apologize into the mic. He set it on the tie next to the chalk X because he wanted what happened to belong to the tie and not to him. He noticed the vibration first in his back teeth and then in his knees, the way distant engines talk before the ground does. The geophone line went from lazy to awake, a slow, regular sawtooth climbing out of nothing. Not footsteps, not water. The period between peaks belonged to a machine built to cross long places. Eli looked down the black and saw nothing. He turned off his light to give himself the lie everyone gives themselves once, and the dark did not return light, only shape. At 12:11 the line sharpened, his head filled with the confident foolishness that lives next to fear in good men. He set 1 foot on the ballast and 1 foot in the gauge so he could get a boot on either side for speed, if speed was what survived people in stories. He breathed through his nose because mouths can betray you, and because he wanted to hear if breath did the wrong thing in a space that loved to teach. His left hand found the cold of the web and remembered other nights and other steel. At 12:12 he heard it. Not a whistle. The absence of one. The tunnel took sound like a debt and did not return it as an echo. The line on his instrument jumped the way small birds do when they decide the new branch will hold. Eli's throat went dry and his palms went wet, and the parts of him that liked their own company urged the rest to get closer. He leaned until his helmet almost touched the granite and listened to nothing get louder.
This is the part that will make you talk to the radio as if you could reach back and pull him by the collar. He kept the light off. He kept his feet where they could commit to direction. He counted because numbers can be a prayer if you're cheap about hope. 11, 12, 13. The world pinched down to a point ahead where headlamps used to die and men used to work with hands and night. The line on the screen became a comb, and then a city, and then a wall.
At exactly 12:13 by a watch he bought at a feed store, light arrived without source, not a beam, a pressure. The air 1 foot above the rail brightened, not white, not yellow, the kind of light you see when your eyes are closed and press your fingers to the lids. It moved at speed without moving. It came from ahead and did not move past, as if a thing had arrived and refused to be measured. Eli lifted the radio and did not report that because his voice had learned restraint. The sound the tunnel made then belongs to a body the tunnel did not own. Steel sang in a way you feel in the small bones of your ear, the unpitched music of weight finding a path. The geophones went mad, The chalk X at his boot turned grey, and then pale as dust lifted and did not fall. He tasted the faint metallic sugar of brake dust that had no brake. He did not step back. He had spent years stepping back at the right moments. He wanted to see what a wrong moment did. Something passed. He will never argue that point with anyone who wasn't there. It passed without mass and with all the signatures of it. The rails thrummed, the air scissored, the stone flexed so slightly he felt it in his belt and not his hand. The light that was not light went through him without changing shape. He did not feel warmth. He felt alignment, the gross act of the world clicking to a notch it had liked once and missed ever since. Eli stood very still and counted to 5 because 5 is polite. When the tunnel remembered it was not an instrument, he turned his headlamp back on and found nothing changed and everything truer. The polished railheads shone like wet enamel. The chalk X was smudged in a way boots do not smudge. Far ahead, where the curve broke sightline, a dozen miner helmets lay where nobody would have dropped them, spaced even, turned outward, their lamps long dead. He did not remember seeing them when he walked in. His recorder on the tie spoke once without him, a click, a breath, a small, unplanned sound a throat makes when it changes its mind. He picked it up and listened to himself not being clever. He wanted to sit down, he wanted to run, he wanted, if we're honest, to hear it again and learn whether the second time kills fear or feeds it. Instead, he did the one rational thing he had left. He spoke a time into the mic, logged his instruments, and walked out at the same pace he had walked in. At the gate, the white letters looked worse than they had. Not because of what they said, because of how tidy they were. He replaced the cut lock with a new one from his kit and left the key under a rock no one uses unless they already know. In his truck, he let the heater lie to his hands and watched the town on the slope sleep with the kind of indifference only mountains can afford. He pressed play on the recorder and heard air, and then the small, patient voice of steel doing work for a thing that does not own it anymore. He didn't know yet about the part of the story that lives outside instruments, about the foreman who would find his gear the next morning sitting exactly where Eli had marked that chalk X, except for one difference, the geophone LED pulsing at 12:13 every night since. He didn't know about the train crew whose names the town says without raising voices, and the missing manifest that no one signs for, and the schedule that still ticks somewhere deep where clocks don't have hands. He drove home with a tunnel inside him, and the hour still hot on the rails he couldn't stop hearing, and a new echo behind his teeth that arrived just a half-second before his breath. By morning, the mountain had convinced itself that nothing strange had happened. The air was clean again, the frost honest, and the town below looked the same as it always had, soft-edged, slow, and half asleep under the weight of November clouds. But Eli hadn't slept at all. He sat at his kitchen table with the recorder in front of him, playing back the tunnel audio over and over until the sound of his own breathing blurred into static. It wasn't what he heard that bothered him. It was what he didn't. There was no whistle, no roar of passing steel, no screech of brakes, but every few minutes, deep in the low frequencies, he could hear a shape, something that rose like pressure and folded back into silence. It wasn't just noise, it had rhythm, like the echo of a train that hadn't existed for 50 years, still keeping its schedule out of habit. He scrubbed the file again and again, eyes fixed on the waveform, and thought of the chalk message on the wall. It is not a time exactly, it is a choice. By noon he gave up pretending he could ignore it. He logged the data, wrote up the report, acoustic anomaly, likely caused by barometric fluctuations, and sent it to Denton, his supervisor. He left out the part about the light, the helmets, and the feeling of something passing through him instead of by. Those details didn't fit in a report, but they stayed in his chest like swallowed wire, every heartbeat catching on it. When Denton called back, his tone was lighter than it should have been. "City says we're extending inspection," he said. "Apparently some folks up by the ridge still hear it. Want you to double-check, just to keep the peace." Eli almost said no. He almost told Denton what it felt like to stand in a tunnel and listen to the world's rules rearrange themselves. But that's not the kind of thing you can explain without watching someone's eyes start to drift. So he agreed, because men like Eli always say yes when the thing that scared them calls back. He loaded the truck that night like a man rehearsing an excuse, telling himself he'd go in, tag the equipment, and leave before midnight. No waiting, no listening. The gate looked different the second time, not broken or moved, just aware. The new lock he'd installed was gone, replaced with an older one that wasn't his. The paint on the letters had run from the last storm, the 1213 half melted down into the gravel. He almost turned around, but a rational mind doesn't lose arguments to rust and superstition. He cut the lock again, stepped inside, and told himself he'd make it quick. The air hit him the same way as before, cold without freshness, like a room that had been breathing on itself too long. His headlamp cut a narrow cone through the black. His footsteps came back late, just a beat slower than they should have. He told himself that was normal. Sound delay in confined spaces, but the explanation didn't stick. The chalk marks he'd made last time were still there, but paler, like the stone had been slowly drinking them away. Halfway in, he stopped at the alcove. The bench was gone, not destroyed or buried, gone. In its place, there was a square patch of dustless floor. In the corner, a faint imprint in the soot caught his eye. 2 lines curved slightly, like the rails themselves had bent inward for a second before straightening again. Eli crouched and ran his fingers through it, half expecting warmth. The stone was cold, but not dead. He checked the geophones next. Both were exactly where he'd left them, but one LED was blinking in a way it shouldn't. It was transmitting, steady pulse, recording. He hadn't turned them on since last night. "All right," he said, voice low, as though speaking to the dark could convince it to behave. He pulled the handheld receiver from his belt, tuned to the right frequency, and waited. The noise that came through wasn't static. It was breathing, slow, mechanical, deep, not human, not wind. He adjusted the gain until the receiver squealed in protest and the sound smoothed into a rhythm. It wasn't coming from the device, it was coming through it, like the tunnel was using his own gear to speak. The waveform spiked every 13 seconds exactly, not 12, not 14, 13. He stood perfectly still until the next pulse came, and then, without thinking, he whispered, "Hello?" The next breath that came through wasn't mechanical anymore. It was soft, wet, and it ended with a sound he'd heard only once before. The faint clang of a coupler catching. That metallic click that means one train has linked to another. Then it stopped. Eli backed up until his shoulders hit stone, the receiver pressed tight to his chest. The geophone light went still, as if embarrassed. The air felt thicker. He didn't run. He walked, slow and measured, like a man in a mine who doesn't trust the ceiling. His headlamp caught old graffiti, newer than last time, wet, still, lines glistening. It was written in the same shaky hand as the chalk before. This time it read, "You made it stop." Beneath that, another line, "It's waiting for you to start it again." Eli stared at it until his light flickered and his stomach turned cold. He wasn't superstitious. He wasn't even sure he believed what his eyes were telling him. But he knew this much. No one else had been in that tunnel. At the choke point, The sound began again. Not a whistle, not quite. A low, rolling tremor that seemed to come from the walls, not the rails. It vibrated in his boots, then in his ribs, then in the space behind his teeth. The geophone in his pocket buzzed once, like it had received an instruction. He pulled it out. The screen showed a steady oscillation, an active reading with no source. He wasn't connected to the rail anymore, but the instrument thought it was. At 12:10, Eli stopped denying what time it was. He checked his watch twice. Both times it showed 12:11, even as the second hand moved. His heart climbed into his throat. He tried to tell himself he'd misread, that fatigue was playing tricks, but the lie came out shallow. He set the receiver on the rail, backed away 2 steps, and waited because that's what part of him still wanted, to hear it again. It started softly. A pressure in the ear, like being underwater. Then the air tightened, and the vibration crawled up from the ballast through his boots and into his bones. His lamp flickered, dimmed, and for a heartbeat he saw the far end of the tunnel light up like dawn. Not electric, not natural. The kind of light you see in old photographs of welders, hot and colourless. His breath caught. The vibration became a rhythm, wheels on rails. He should have run. He didn't, because some part of him, some quiet, stupid part, needed proof. The light swelled, filling the curve, and he saw it, the silhouette of an engine that wasn't there. A shadow made of luminescence, framed by smoke that didn't move. It rushed forward without sound, without friction, the way a memory rushes through you before you know it's back. And then, as before, it passed. When the light vanished, so did everything else. His lamp went dead. The air was suddenly freezing. He couldn't hear the wind outside or the creak of the tunnel anymore. Just a single tone, low and endless, vibrating through his chest like his body had become another rail. His watch clicked once, then stopped at exactly 12:13. He stood there, gripping his dead lamp, the dark pressing against him like wet fabric. When he could move again, he turned toward the portal and started walking. Every sound was wrong now. His boots hit the ground out of sync, the echoes landing before the step. He couldn't tell if he was closer to the gate or deeper inside. The tunnel had rearranged itself. It took him an hour to see light again. When he finally stumbled outside, the world looked pale and flat, the stars too bright, the air too still. His truck was covered in a thin layer of frost, even though it wasn't cold enough for that. He sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before starting the engine. The recorder was still in his jacket pocket. When he pressed play, the file hissed, then cleared, and a voice, not his, spoke, faint and distant, like it came through water. "Clear the line," it said, then again, slower. "Clear the line." The next sound was the same coupler click he'd heard in the dark, and then a long silence that somehow didn't feel empty. He turned it off and didn't touch it again. The report he filed the next morning was 4 sentences long. No structural hazard detected, possible subsonic interference from rock strata, instruments recalibrated, further entry not recommended. He didn't tell Denton about the voice, or the light, or the way the rails had felt warm when he left. He told himself it didn't matter, but every night after that, just before he fell asleep, he'd hear it again in the static hum of his fridge or the pipes in his wall, the sound of a whistle that didn't echo moving through him. And though Eli didn't know it yet, 2 nights later, when the foreman went to collect his gear, the geophones were gone. The receiver was still recording. The readout showed a steady pulse, right on time, every night since. 12:13, that's when the mountain breathes. That's when the rails remember what they were built for. And somewhere under 100 feet of rock, the tunnel waits for one more signalman to start the line again. In the days that followed, Eli's world began to fold in on itself in small, deliberate ways. His clocks drifted, no matter how often he reset them. His tools hummed faintly on the workbench, a vibration you couldn't hear but could feel in your bones. Even the street outside his window had a rhythm now, the passing cars, the clack of their tires over a loose manhole cover. All of it sinking to an invisible beat he didn't want to recognize. Every night at 12:13, he'd wake without knowing why, the room silent except for the faint rattle of something metallic, far away but perfectly timed. He started sleeping in the living room with the TV on low, the sound of other people's voices buying him a few hours of peace before the static found its way back in. His supervisor, Denton, called 3 days later, annoyed in the way only a bureaucrat can be. "Got your report," he said. "But the readings don't match. We sent another guy up there this morning. He said your sensors were still active." Eli stiffened. "I shut them off," he said. "Pulled power myself." Denton clicked his pen on the other end of the line, a small, percussive noise that suddenly felt too close. Well, they were blinking when he found them. Said he heard something too, probably wind. Anyway, the city wants a full removal before the demolition crew goes in next week. Eli didn't argue. He knew he'd have to go back. By sunset, the mountain had gone quiet again, like it was holding its breath. Eli drove the truck slower this time, headlights carving long tunnels through the mist that had settled on the switchbacks. The gate was unlocked when he arrived, not broken, not forced, just unlatched, hanging open an inch. His new padlock was missing, but the old one, the original one, lay in the dirt by the fence, clean as if it had never rusted at all. He crouched, touched it, and felt a pulse through the metal. Just once. He dropped it and backed away. Inside, the tunnel greeted him like it remembered his name. The air was warmer this time, thicker. The walls gleamed faintly with moisture that hadn't been there before. His headlamp beam cut through it, making the air shimmer, particles of dust and condensation forming a slow, swirling fog. He followed the rail line carefully, counting steps, whispering the numbers under his breath to keep his nerves from unspooling. At the alcove, the bench was back, but now it wasn't empty. Sitting on it was his old thermos. He hadn't left it there. He'd left it in his truck. He reached for it slowly. The metal was cold, the kind of cold that burns skin on contact. He turned it over, and his initials were there, carved with the same pocket knife he'd carried for years. When he unscrewed the lid, the smell hit him first. Coffee and something else. Iron. He tipped it slightly, and what poured out wasn't liquid anymore. A thick, black sludge ran over his boots and into the ballast. It steamed where it landed. Eli dropped the thermos and stumbled back, his heart thudding. The sludge didn't spread. It soaked straight into the ground and vanished. He wiped his boots with his sleeve and kept walking, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking was worse. The geophones were gone. In their place were small indentations in the gravel, perfectly round, like the weight of the devices had pressed the stone into memory, but in each hollow there was something new. Metal shavings, curled and blackened, as if the instruments had rusted away in minutes instead of days. The handheld receiver, though, lay untouched in the middle of the tracks, still powered on. The screen blinked once every 13 seconds, a soft green pulse. He lifted it to his ear, half expecting silence. Instead, he heard the faint crackle of a radio transmission. "Dispatcher to Engine 12? Copy?" The voice was distant, wrapped in static, but the cadence was unmistakable. Railroad chatter, mid-century, the kind you only hear on old analog recordings. Eli froze. The transmission stuttered again. "Dispatcher to Engine 12. Your manifest incomplete. Confirm crew on board." Then a long pause, and finally, a reply, hollow and slow. Confirmed. Crew. Accounted for. The words dragged, like they'd come through water. Eli's stomach turned to stone. He knew that call sign. Engine 12 had gone missing in 1975 along this same line during a tunnel collapse that had killed 6 men. There hadn't been a dispatcher to answer in 50 years. He tried to speak, but the air wouldn't let him. His throat was tight, his breath shallow. Then came the sound, low at first, like thunder trapped under stone. The rail beneath his feet began to tremble. He dropped the receiver and backed away, watching as the tunnel ahead of him filled with light. Not blinding this time, pale, sickly, like old fluorescence behind fogged glass. He squinted and saw movement in the haze, figures. Not solid, not clear, but silhouettes walking along the tracks, slow and deliberate. They were men, or they had been. He could tell by the shape of their shoulders, the way they leaned forward as if carrying invisible weight. Their helmets glowed faintly, but their lamps were dark. They moved in single file, following the curvature of the tunnel, their bodies flickering like film caught in an old projector. Eli pressed his back to the wall, every instinct screaming to run, but his boots were rooted. One of the figures slowed near him, its face turning just enough for him to see. There was nothing there, no eyes, no mouth, just a blur of skin and shadow stretched into the suggestion of a man who had been erased. The figure lifted its hand, palm out, as if to warn him, and then, without sound, continued walking, disappearing into the black behind him. The light faded, the vibration stopped. The tunnel exhaled once, heavy and final. Then came the whisper. It wasn't from the figures, it was from the walls. "Clear the line!" Eli bolted. His light swung wildly as he ran, throwing ghosts against the walls with every step. His breath echoed back at him in jagged bursts. The air grew thinner, sharper. The entrance took forever to appear, but when it did, he didn't stop until he was outside, doubled over in the gravel, gasping. The night was quiet. The stars steady. But the sound of the tunnel lingered behind him, a soft hum that felt like waiting. He threw the receiver into the dirt and kicked it toward the fence, but it kept blinking, steady as a heartbeat. He didn't remember driving home. He only remembered waking up at his kitchen table hours later, the sun bleeding through the blinds, the same steady pulse vibrating through the floorboards. His radio was off, the refrigerator was silent, but under it all, beneath the hum of the house itself, he could hear it, the low, rolling rumble of a train that wasn't there. He stood, staggered to the window, and looked out toward the ridgeline. Far in the distance, just at the edge of town, a thin line of mist rose from the trees, glowing faintly in the morning light. By noon, the pulse had faded, but the damage was done. Eli's instruments, his phone, even his watch, all of them desynced from real time, each lagging by the same 13 seconds. He called Denton, voice low, calm, like a man negotiating with a loaded gun. "I'm done," he said. "Seal the line, pour concrete. Don't send anyone else down there." Denton laughed nervously. "You're not serious." Eli didn't laugh. "It's not a tunnel anymore," he said. "It's a signal, and it's not done transmitting." That night, at exactly 12:13, the receiver he'd left in the dirt outside the gate blinked to life one final time. The foreman who found it the next morning said the device was still warm, even though the air had dropped below freezing. The last recording on it was only 5 seconds long. A breath, the coupler click, then a voice that was unmistakably Eli's, though no one could explain how. "Engine 12, it said, "all accounted for." Back in town, the mountains slept. The line was sealed, the tunnel filled. The company moved on to safer projects, but every night since, long after the clocks hit 12:13, a single, faint tremor runs through the old rail bed as though something beneath is still keeping time. Locals call it the heartbeat. The rest of the world calls it a geological fluke. And somewhere under 100 feet of stone, where light can't go and echoes don't come back, a voice keeps whispering in the dark. "Clear the line." Then the faint, rhythmic sound of wheels, rolling, steady, never stopping. When the mountain thawed, the story of Eli Marsh was already halfway to being forgotten. That's how these things usually go. A few official reports, a brief write-up in the local paper, and then silence, quiet, bureaucratic silence that feels almost respectful until you realize it's just indifference dressed up in a suit. The rail company listed him as missing in the line of duty. His tools were returned to the depot. His truck was reassigned. By summer, a new technician had his ID badge. And yet, in the homes that lined the valley, people still whispered about what they'd heard that winter. Not gossip, not quite. Just a question nobody wanted to ask too loud. What really happened in the tunnel under Blackstone Ridge? For 3 months, the tunnel sat sealed beneath its concrete plug, humming faintly under the weight of the mountain. The work crews said the vibrations were normal, groundwater freezing and thawing, but they didn't linger near it. Every now and then, a maintenance truck would idle too long by the gate, and the radio inside would catch a burst of static. One driver swore he heard a voice through it, a single phrase before the signal cleared. "Clear the line." When the foreman told him to stop drinking on shift, he quit instead. The company welded the gate shut and posted warning signs, but they never came back to check them. The ridge itself grew strange after that. Animals avoided it. Deer trails that had cut across the slope for generations bent wide around the mouth of the tunnel. Even the pines near the gate started to lean, their roots clutching rock like they were holding on to something that wanted out. The locals, of course, noticed. They always do. But mountain towns learn early how to treat fear like weather, something to be endured, not solved. So when the first frost came, and the valley wind carried that long, low whistle again, no one said a word. They just turned their porch lights off and waited for it to pass. Then one morning in late February, a highway survey crew picked up an anomaly on their vibration sensors. A low-frequency tremor, consistent and rhythmic, running directly beneath the old line. Every 13 seconds, like a heartbeat. The equipment tech flagged it as seismic noise, but the team lead, Harper, a former miner, didn't buy that explanation. He'd felt earthquakes before. This wasn't one. "It's too steady," he told his partner. "It's not movement, it's motion." The two men stood there in the frost, listening to the ground with the kind of attention people usually reserve for confessions. And in the silence between tremors, they both heard it, a whistle. Faint, almost polite. Coming from below, they brought the readings back to the office, expecting to be laughed at. But the data didn't lie. The signal was real, repeating, precise, impossible. Someone higher up called it an underground harmonic resonance. Someone else called it a prank. And when Harper suggested sealing off the ridge again, his supervisor smiled thinly and said, "We already did." That night, Harper's laptop started recording by itself. No microphone, no app running. Just a file that grew by the second. When he played it back, there was only one sound, the faint, steady rhythm of steel wheels rolling through a place that hadn't existed for decades. By spring, the story had made its way back to town. At first, it lived on bar stools and in late-night diner booths. Then it reached the internet. A local reporter wrote a half-skeptical article titled "The Train That Never Stopped." She mentioned Eli by name, quoted Denton's old report, even included grainy photos of the sealed gate. It should have died there, in the churn of small-town myth. But people have a way of feeding ghosts when they're bored. Within weeks, amateur ghost hunters were posting YouTube videos claiming to hear the whistle. TikTok had a filter that mimicked the tunnel's sound, and somewhere in the noise, the truth got lost, buried again, the way it always does. Denton didn't like any of it. He was nearing retirement, worn down by years of explaining away things that shouldn't have happened. But when he saw the article with Eli's name in print, something twisted in his gut. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was obligation. The kind that follows you even after you've done your best to forget. So one afternoon, he drove up the ridge himself. The road was worse than he remembered. Washed out and narrow, the kind that makes you keep one hand on the emergency brake out of habit. When he finally reached the gate, he felt his chest tighten. The welds were gone. Not broken. Gone. The seams were clean, the bolts smooth, the metal cool and untouched. The warning signs hung limp on their chains. For a long moment, Denton just stood there, staring at the opening. The air beyond looked darker than it should. Not black exactly, just deeper. He called out once, his voice small against the stone. No echo. He took a step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots, and another until he stood at the threshold. Then he stopped, because the air was moving. Slowly, steadily, in and out, like the mountain was breathing. He turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. Half buried near the entrance, in the shadow of a leaning pine, was a helmet. Yellow plastic, faded to bone white. He picked it up without thinking. The name scratched into the side was still visible. E. Marsh. Inside, the lining was gone, replaced by a film of frost that didn't melt in his hand. Beneath it, something dark shimmered, a pattern etched into the plastic like veins. It pulsed once, faintly, when the wind shifted. Denton dropped it and stumbled back. The air in the tunnel grew colder. He heard the faint, distant whine of metal expanding, the ghost of a brake hiss. Then silence. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. Who would believe him? Instead, he called the county, said there'd been vandalism, and requested the gate be resealed. But that night, long after he'd poured himself enough bourbon to forget, the power in his house flickered, his radio, dead for years, clicked on by itself. A hiss of static filled the room, followed by a familiar, steady voice. "Engine 12, it said, all accounted for." The words were clear. The voice was Eli's. Denton didn't sleep again that night. By summer, the valley was alive with stories again. Locals said the mountain glowed at night. Truckers claimed their CB radios picked up phantom chatter near the old rail crossing, calls and responses in an accent that hadn't been heard since the 70s. The town council asked the rail company to officially deny the rumours. The rail company, in classic fashion, denied everything. That didn't help, it never does. If anything, it made people hungrier. And soon, the story stopped being about ghosts and started being about challenge. That's how the 3 college kids came into it. They were film students from Denver, chasing viral views and half a dare. They'd heard the stories online, watched the shaky cell phone videos, and decided to prove it was fake. They brought cameras, microphones, a drone, and the kind of reckless confidence that comes from not believing the world can touch you yet. Their footage, what little of it survived, was found 2 weeks later on an SD card buried in snow. The rest of their gear was scattered across the ridge. Their car was still parked on the overlook road, engine cold, doors locked from the inside. The video begins normally, flashlights, laughter, the familiar voice of bravado hiding fear. They hike up the ridge, joking about Eli's ghost shift. At 6 minutes in, they reach the gate. It's sealed, concrete smooth, the welds gleaming under their lights. They take turns knocking, shouting, laughing. For a while, it's all noise and confidence. Then, at 8 minutes, The air changes. You can hear it even on the recording, a low hum beneath their voices. One of them stops laughing and asks if anyone else feels the ground moving. The others don't answer. At 9 minutes 30, the flashlight beams start shaking. The camera catches small flecks of dust rising from the cracks in the concrete, drifting upward like ash in reverse. One of the kids whispers, "It's breathing." The audio cuts for half a second, replaced by a tone so low it's almost inaudible, then a pop, like a speaker blowing out. When the video comes back, the concrete is cracking, not violently, just splitting in a perfect line down the center, light spilling through as thin as a razor. The camera jerks away. Someone screams. At 11 minutes, the image goes sideways. The flashlight hits the ground, and the lens stares at gravel and moving shadows. For 20 seconds, nothing happens. Then, faintly, a sound, wheels, slow, rhythmic, impossibly close. The camera shakes once, hard, as if something heavy just passed by. A voice, calm, quiet, not theirs, speaks from somewhere behind the lens. Clear the line. Then silence. The recording ends at exactly 12 minutes and 13 seconds. Authorities called it a hoax, said the kids faked it, added sound effects, spliced in light leaks for drama. But when the search team arrived, they found the ground around the gate coated in frost, even though the temperature was 40 degrees. 2 long grooves had been pressed into the gravel, perfectly parallel, spaced like rails. They stopped at the concrete seal. The frost stopped there too. After that, the company brought in demolition crews. Denton begged them not to. He said the tunnel should stay buried. But corporate didn't believe in ghosts, only liability. They ordered the seal removed, the line excavated, the site cleared. It took 3 weeks of blasting through stone and concrete before the workers hit the old chamber. What they found made no sense. The tunnel extended half a mile farther than any map showed. The walls were smooth, polished like glass, and the rails, steel that should have rusted to dust decades ago, shone like they'd been laid yesterday. They sent a drone in first. It flew steady for exactly 12 minutes. Then the feed cut out. When they recovered the footage, the last frame showed something impossible, a rail junction with a signal still burning green, its light reflecting off a surface that wasn't there. And to the side of the track, half-shadowed, stood a man in a hard hat, back turned, one hand raised in a wave. The reflective strip on his jacket caught the light. The name was visible. Marsh. The project was shut down the next day. Officially, the company cited unstable geological conditions. Unofficially, no one wanted to go near the ridge. The demolition crew signed NDAs and refused interviews. One of them, years later, told his brother over a drunk Christmas call that he'd heard the whistle while they were sealing it back up. It wasn't loud, he said. It was polite, like it didn't want to interrupt. Since then, the ridge has been empty. The road to the gate is blocked by concrete barriers, the trees reclaiming the cut. But the sound never stopped. On clear winter nights, when the air's dry and the stars look too sharp, the valley hums. A vibration runs through the soil, faint but steady, every 13 seconds. Sometimes it's just a tremor, sometimes it's more. Campers have reported headlights moving through fog at ground level. A dog walker once swore he heard voices by the old service road, men shouting over wind, calling out signal times in words that haven't been used since the 1970s. Denton retired not long after. He sold his house, left the state, tried to outdistance whatever was still running under his ribs. But some nights, when sleep wouldn't come, he'd hear it again. The low whistle, the coupler click, the faint voice saying all accounted for. It never scared him anymore, just reminded him that some engines, once started, don't stop. They just keep to their timetable, no matter who's still on board. And now, years later, that's what the town still talks about. The kids don't call it a haunting anymore. They call it the heartbeat. They say the mountain keeps its own rhythm now, that it remembers what used to run through its veins. Trains are creatures of pattern and purpose. They follow their rails even when the world forgets the destination. Maybe that's what Eli became, a signalman who refused to clock out. If you ever find yourself near Blackstone Ridge after midnight, you might hear it too. The low, rolling hum, the faint vibration under your feet, the whistle that doesn't echo. And if you stand very still, you might feel the pressure shift as the air grows tight, and you'll know what that means. The line is clear. The train is coming through. It won't slow down, it never does. It will pass straight through you, quiet, efficient, relentless, and for just a second, you'll understand why the men who built it never stopped hearing it. Because some things aren't supposed to end, they just change tracks. They wait for the right hour, the right signal, the right listener, and every night, at exactly 12:13, under the bones of a mountain that forgot how to sleep, the train that never stopped keeps running, steady as time, soft as breath, carrying the ghosts of those who kept the line alive, forever making sure the way ahead stays clear. And that is the end of tonight's stories. 3 forgotten places, 3 ordinary people who stepped inside to find something the world had already buried. A house that screamed when the wind touched it, a garden that learned how to grow things that could think, and a train that never stopped running its route, even after time itself gave up on it. It's strange, right? How every one of these stories feels like it could only happen once. Yet they all share the same quiet message. Some places don't decay. They wait. They remember every voice, every footstep, every secret we think we left behind. They sit in the dark, patient, practicing the sound of our names, just in case we ever come back. So if you ever find yourself drawn to an abandoned place, some house, some tunnel, some locked door that looks too interesting to ignore, just stop for a second. Listen, because sometimes the things we call empty aren't empty at all. They're listening back. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an episode. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this channel alive for those of us who love exploring the dark corners of forgotten places. This has been minute 60, where every story stops right before the hour, but never quite ends. Sleep well tonight. Just maybe don't listen too closely if the wind starts to sound like breathing.